Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. Ludwig II of Bavaria. A king who lived in a world of fantasy and absurdity. A man who ruled from 1864 until his mysterious death in 1886. But don't be fooled by the grandeur of his royal title, for Ludwig's reign was far from the fairy tale you might imagine. Known to the world as the Mad King, his reign was defined by eccentricity, lavish spending, and a refusal to bow to the royal duties expected of him. His obsession with building castles, like the famous Neuschwanstein, became his obsession, his masterpiece, while his family grew increasingly frustrated with his lavish and often incomprehensible projects. Ludwig's strained relationship with the royal family left him isolated, and the financial turmoil he sparked through his reckless spending left his kingdom teetering on the brink of ruin. The Mad King wasn't just a nickname. It was a harsh reflection of his inability to distinguish between his dream world and the very real consequences of his delusions. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Ludwig II of Bavaria's childhood was marked by an atmosphere so steeped in tension and contradiction that it's no surprise he would later grow into the man who would be dubbed the Mad King. Born in 1845 to Maximilian II, the King of Bavaria, and Princess Marie of Prussia, Ludwig's life was not one of carefree innocence or joy. No, his early years were dominated by the oppressive presence of his father, a ruler whose expectations and commands would carve a deep, unsettling mark on the young prince's psyche. Maximilian, a man who demanded perfection in every corner of his kingdom, also imposed an iron will on his son. From an early age, Ludwig was subjected to the harsh discipline of his father's court, where affection and warmth were nowhere to be found. The future king was raised in a bubble, isolated from the world by the barriers his father erected around him. He was carefully shielded from the mundane complexities of life, instead wrapped in a gilded cage of royal expectations, where he was taught to be the perfect monarch, devoid of any vulnerability. Maximilian, in his quest to shape his son into a ruler of order and authority, did nothing to nurture Ludwig's creativity or emotional needs, leaving a void that would soon grow into obsession and madness. Ludwig's childhood, if one were to call it that, was less a tale of carefree play and more a brutal conditioning to meet the crushing weight of his future role as king. Every day, his father's looming presence reminded him that he was not allowed to be a child. He was to be a symbol of power, not a person with thoughts and desires of his own. It's easy to imagine that young Ludwig, never given a chance to be free, would have felt like an ornament in a house of stone. A puppet with no strings to cut, forever bound by his father's will. His early years, therefore, were not those of joyous exploration or innocent growth. Instead, they were ones marked by a growing sense of detachment, of disconnection from any real warmth or love, replaced by a chilling expectation of dutiful obedience to a throne he hadn't yet claimed, yet was still burdened by. It is within this environment of emotional neglect that Ludwig's eccentricities began to form. And when you're never allowed to explore who you truly are, what else can you do but build grand, impossible castles in your mind, dreaming of a world where you are free from the suffocating grip of authority? By the time Ludwig's father, Maximilian II, passed away in 1864, the young prince was only 18 years old. His ascension to the throne came abruptly, a sudden and unexpected shift in his life's trajectory that would forever alter the course of history. One day, he was merely a frightened, isolated youth, cloistered away in the cold, impersonal halls of his father's palaces. The next, he was thrust into the throne room of Bavaria, expected to rule over a kingdom with no guidance and no real preparation for the monumental task ahead. The death of Maximilian was like the pulling of a thread that unraveled a tapestry of carefully constructed lies, leaving Ludwig exposed to the harsh realities of a world that cared little for his youthful naivety. No longer protected by the towering, oppressive shadow of his father, Ludwig was thrust into a role he had neither the maturity nor the emotional fortitude to handle. It was as if he had been ripped from the pages of a fairy tale. Those stories where a prince, unprepared for the weight of a crown, stumbles through a journey of glory and ruin. But for Ludwig, there would be no glory. His reign would be a slow and terrifying descent into madness, a tragic story of a young man who could not cope with the expectations thrust upon him. In those first years of his reign, Ludwig's public image was that of a naive, almost fragile monarch. The people of Bavaria, the royal court, and the world at large all expected him to be a typical monarch, a figurehead who would take up the mantle of tradition and uphold the legacy of his father. But what they didn't understand, and what they couldn't possibly have known, was that Ludwig had no desire to fit into the role that was laid out for him. He was too consumed by the visions in his mind, the overwhelming fantasies of an otherworldly grandeur that seemed to seep into his every thought. The people who looked to him for strength and direction, for leadership in the face of Bavaria's changing political landscape, found instead a king who was more concerned with constructing his own fantasy realm. They expected him to be the embodiment of authority, power, and traditional kingship, but what they got was a king who spent his time in solitude, locked away in his castles, dreaming of impossible worlds, leaving the affairs of the kingdom to crumble around him. His youth was viewed with a mixture of sympathy and concern, as the public could hardly fathom the depths of madness that lurked beneath Ludwig's carefully composed exterior. The world watched as this young, inexperienced king struggled to meet the weight of royal expectations, while also trying, desperately, to build a world of his own design, a world where the suffocating grip of tradition and duty could not reach him. Yet, Ludwig's detachment from his people only deepened as the pressure mounted. He grew more withdrawn, his obsession with his castles and fantasies more consuming. To the court, Ludwig seemed to be a king who had no interest in ruling, only in escaping the very reality that his reign was meant to protect. And so, as the years passed, the people of Bavaria grew to see him less as their monarch and more as an enigmatic, almost mythical figure, one who could no longer be counted on to fulfill the duties of kingship. His reign, thus, was one marked not by the expected leadership of a king, but by the spiraling delusions of a man trapped in his own mind, where the world outside his castle walls seemed increasingly irrelevant. But beyond the surface, behind the cold eyes of the mad king, lay a man who had been broken long before he had ever sat upon the throne. His early life, spent under the oppressive rule of his father, had set him on a path he could neither escape nor control. His ascension to the throne was a cruel twist of fate, an unexpected rise to power that only deepened his isolation and cemented his tragic destiny. He had not been prepared for the role he was thrust into, and as he sank deeper into his delusions, he would only become more isolated, more consumed by the world he was creating in his mind. And the tragedy of Ludwig II was not just that he could not fulfill the expectations placed upon him, but that he could never escape the cruel and suffocating grip of his past, a grip that would lead him into a final, inevitable demise, far from the grandeur he sought. In the early years of Ludwig's reign, Bavaria watched with a sense of cautious optimism and growing concern. The young king had inherited a realm at a time when political instability was beginning to take hold in Europe. Yet rather than focusing on the duties of kingship, Ludwig was obsessed with his own fantasies, retreating into a world of castles, mythical dreams, and impossible plans. His early reign was marked by a series of puzzling decisions that made it clear to those around him that Ludwig was not a king in the traditional sense. The expectations of his court and the people were slowly eroded by his increasingly erratic behavior. He would retreat to his castles for weeks on end, abandoning the kingdom's affairs to be handled by others, and making little to no effort to govern as he was expected to. In those first years, the public image of Ludwig was that of a youthful monarch, naive and ill-suited for the complexities of rule. But beneath this veneer of inexperience, a much darker truth was beginning to emerge, a truth that would define his reign and tarnish his legacy forever. Ludwig's early life and his ascension to the throne were the beginning of a slow, inevitable unraveling. From the sheltered isolation of his childhood to the shocking weight of the crown, Ludwig was never given a chance to understand the world around him. Instead, he retreated into the fantasy world he created for himself, a world where he could escape the crushing demands of reality. His reign was one defined by the dissonance between the world he inhabited in his mind and the world that demanded his leadership. The tragic irony of Ludwig's life was that, despite all the grandeur and ambition he harbored, he was unable to bring any of it to fruition in the real world. His reign was a slow collapse into madness, a madness that started long before he ever donned the crown, and one that would haunt him until his mysterious death. Ludwig II's obsession with fantasy and the pursuit of a kingdom built not on the foundations of political stability or economic prosperity, but on the weight of his own delusions, led him to the monumental creation of Neuschwanstein Castle. It was in 1869 that construction began on what would become one of the most famous castles in the world, a fantastical palace that, in many ways, symbolized the depths of Ludwig's growing detachment from reality. But Neuschwanstein was not merely a castle. It was Ludwig's dream made stone, his obsession crystallized in towering spires and flowing, gilded walls. From the moment the plans were drawn up, the castle became a sacred project, a representation of Ludwig's desire to build a world that he could escape into, a world that was free from the harshness and pressures of kingship. It was, in his mind, a perfect kingdom, untouched by the messiness of governance or the duties of a monarch. With each stone laid, the castle became more of a prison for Ludwig, a tangible manifestation of his isolation, his madness, and his refusal to engage with the real world that clamored for his attention. Neuschwanstein was, of course, not born out of thin air. It had its roots in Ludwig's obsession with romantic and medieval ideals, a longing for a world that had never truly existed but that, to him, seemed far superior to the one he had inherited. His fascination with the past, specifically the medieval era, guided the architectural designs of the castle. Ludwig did not want to build something that was simply grand or imposing. He sought to create a palace that would transport him into another time, a time of knights, kings, and legends. It was the romanticized idea of the Middle Ages that would inform every inch of Neuschwanstein, making it less a royal residence and more a fairy tale castle sprung from the pages of an ancient saga. The design of the castle was infused with elements of medieval romance, inspired by the Gothic architecture that captivated Ludwig's imagination. Towers rose like the spires of a forgotten cathedral, and the walls were adorned with images and symbols of a time long past, a time Ludwig longed for, as if by building it, he could return to that idealized age. The construction of Neuschwanstein, in its very essence, was an attempt to recreate a lost world, a world in which Ludwig could be the king of his own dreams, not the king of a troubled and decaying kingdom. It was, of course, no coincidence that Ludwig found inspiration in the works of Richard Wagner, the composer whose music stirred in him a deep, almost obsessive passion. Wagner, whose operas spoke of gods, heroes, and tragic destinies, was not just a composer to Ludwig. He was a savior of sorts, a man whose artistry could transport Ludwig into the very world he sought to create. Wagner's influence on Ludwig was profound, almost to the point of obsession, and it was through the composer's works that Ludwig found his idealized vision of royalty and grandeur. The castles that Ludwig envisioned, the mythical kingdoms he sought to build, were, in many ways, reflections of the operas Wagner wrote. It was Wagner's influence that inspired Ludwig to fill Neuschwanstein with references to his operas, to create a space where the world of Wagner's music could live and breathe. The idea of constructing a castle to house his fantasies was not merely a whim. It was an attempt to bring Wagner's operatic worlds to life, to live in the fantasy that Wagner's music had given him. Neuschwanstein became, in many ways, a physical manifestation of this passion, an extravagant attempt to merge the world of art, fantasy, and monarchy into something tangible, something Ludwig could hold onto as the real world around him slipped further into disarray. But the cost of this dream was immense, and it is here that Ludwig's obsession with fantasy and his utter disregard for the consequences of his actions truly begin to show the dangerous nature of his reign. The construction of Neuschwanstein, like many of Ludwig's projects, was financed by the state of Bavaria, using public funds that could have been better spent on the pressing issues of the kingdom. From the very beginning, the project drained the national treasury, creating deficits that would only grow as the years passed. The costs of construction were astronomical, and the money that poured into the project came at the expense of the very people Ludwig was supposed to govern. As Neuschwanstein rose from the ground, the kingdom around it began to crumble, its finances teetering on the edge of collapse. The economic toll of the castle was devastating, and yet Ludwig seemed entirely unconcerned with the repercussions of his actions. To him, the castle was not just a structure. It was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could save him from the crushing weight of his duties. The rest of the world, with all its messy, real problems, was irrelevant. Neuschwanstein was his escape, his fantasy, and if it took every last coin of the kingdom to build, so be it. The financial strain that Neuschwanstein placed on Bavaria was catastrophic, and yet Ludwig, in his madness, refused to acknowledge the damage he was causing. As the debts mounted and the kingdom's resources dwindled, Ludwig remained obsessed with completing his dream, blind to the growing suffering around him. The people of Bavaria, who were already struggling with economic hardships, found themselves burdened by a king who had no interest in their welfare, no concern for their needs. Instead, Ludwig poured money into his dream, building a castle that would never truly be finished, a monument to his own delusions. The kingdom's infrastructure, its economy, and its people all suffered, while Ludwig built his fantasy world stone by stone. In the end, the castle was a testament not to Ludwig's brilliance or vision, but to his dangerous detachment from the reality of his reign. Neuschwanstein, like so many of his other projects, was a product of his madness, an obsession that overshadowed everything else. It was a cruel and reckless endeavor, one that drained the resources of the kingdom and left it teetering on the brink of ruin. Ludwig's obsession with Neuschwanstein was not just about building a castle. It was about creating a kingdom that existed only in his mind. As he watched his dream take shape, stone by stone, he became increasingly isolated from the real world, retreating further into the fantasy he was constructing. The people of Bavaria were mere shadows in his eyes, their needs and desires irrelevant compared to the grandeur he was building. The financial ruin that the project brought was of little consequence to Ludwig. He was too consumed by his own fantasies to care. And as the kingdom's resources dwindled, as the deficit grew and the people struggled, Ludwig's detachment became more pronounced. The Neuschwanstein project was not just a financial catastrophe. It was a symbol of Ludwig's growing inability to face the responsibilities of kingship. Instead of leading his people, he retreated into his castles, building them higher, dreaming bigger, until the reality of his reign collapsed beneath him. The construction of Neuschwanstein Castle was, in many ways, the culmination of Ludwig's desires for escape, for fantasy, for a world that existed outside of the constraints of his reign. It was a beautiful, impossible dream, one that would never come to fruition in the way Ludwig envisioned. The castle, for all its grandeur and beauty, became a tomb for Ludwig's reign, a symbol of his madness and a cruel reminder of the king who could not govern, who could not see beyond his own delusions. In the end, Neuschwanstein was more than just a castle. It was the physical embodiment of Ludwig's detachment, his cruelty to the people who suffered in the real world while he chased a fantasy that could never be realized. And as the castle rose higher into the sky, so too did the debt, the suffering, and the growing disillusionment with the king who would never be able to fulfill the promises of his reign. Ludwig's obsession with Neuschwanstein Castle, and with his fantasy kingdom as a whole, was a reflection of his refusal to face the real world and his inability to govern effectively. The castle, in its beauty and grandeur, represented everything he could never achieve in reality: control, power, and the ability to shape the world around him. Yet, despite its aesthetic triumphs, Neuschwanstein stood as a grim reminder of Ludwig's inability to address the real problems facing his kingdom. It was, in many ways, a monument to his madness, a structure built with the blood and sweat of his people, yet completely detached from the very world that had created it. The cost of the castle was immense, and Ludwig's obsession with it marked the beginning of his downfall. His reign, once full of potential, would crumble under the weight of his fantasies, leaving behind a legacy of ruin and loss. Ludwig II's architectural ambitions were not confined to Neuschwanstein Castle alone. He was driven by an insatiable need to create a kingdom that existed only in his mind, a kingdom that bore no resemblance to the decaying reality of his rule. Every structure he conceived was more than just a building. It was an extension of his delusions, a physical manifestation of the grand, fantastical world he sought to inhabit, away from the messiness of politics and the crushing responsibilities of kingship. Linderhof Palace, although smaller than Neuschwanstein, was no less opulent or extravagant. Built between 1874 and 1878, Linderhof was Ludwig's personal refuge, his sanctuary from the duties of ruling, and a space where his obsession with beauty and excess could be fully realized. This palace, hidden away in the Bavarian Alps, was more than just a retreat. It was a monument to Ludwig's egotism, a place where the king could immerse himself in the fantasy world that he had created. Every detail of the palace was designed to transport him to a different time and place, a time when kings were rulers of entire empires, where their will was law, and where every whim could be indulged without consequence. The palace's centerpiece was the Venus Grotto, a stunning, artificial cave constructed to resemble the mythical underworld of Venus, the goddess of love. This grotto was a grotesque expression of Ludwig's descent into madness, a place where he could retreat and indulge in fantasies of romance and myth. The Venus Grotto, with its eerie, glowing lights and the haunting sound of water trickling from its artificial streams, was both a beautiful and unsettling creation. It was the perfect embodiment of Ludwig's obsession with fantasy, an elaborate, artificial world that existed solely to satisfy his own desires. As he sat in the grotto, alone in the dim light, surrounded by the echoes of his own thoughts, Ludwig must have felt that he was far removed from the reality of the kingdom he had abandoned. The gilded palace, with its elaborate Rococo designs and rich tapestries, was a far cry from the impoverished kingdom that suffered under his reckless rule. But Ludwig did not care. To him, the palace was more important than the people who depended on him. It was his fantasy, his sanctuary, and in its beauty, he could escape the crushing demands of reality. But Linderhof was only the beginning of Ludwig's architectural madness. His next grand project, Herrenchiemsee Palace, would reveal the true extent of his delusions. Inspired by the grandeur of the Palace of Versailles in France, Herrenchiemsee was an attempt to recreate the luxurious splendor of the French monarchy. It was Ludwig's obsession with French royalty that drove him to replicate the palace of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose lavish court and extravagant lifestyle he so admired. In his mind, Ludwig was not just a Bavarian king. He was a monarch of mythical proportions, deserving of the same grandeur and luxury that the kings of France had once enjoyed. He sought to build a palace that would outshine all others, a symbol of his power and wealth, a statement to the world that he was not bound by the same limitations that governed ordinary rulers. But like all of Ludwig's grand dreams, Herrenchiemsee was nothing more than a hollow monument to his delusions, a reflection of his inability to face the harsh realities of his reign. Construction on Herrenchiemsee began in 1878, but it would never be completed. The palace was designed to be a mirror image of Versailles, with its vast, opulent halls, its elaborate gardens, and its countless rooms dedicated to excess. Ludwig's obsession with Versailles was so deep that he went to great lengths to replicate every detail of the French palace, even importing craftsmen from France to ensure that no element was left to chance. The palace was built on a small island in Lake Chiemsee, surrounded by the natural beauty of the Bavarian countryside, and Ludwig intended it to be a symbol of his superiority over the world around him. But as the project dragged on, the costs continued to mount, and Ludwig's delusions grew ever more intense. He became consumed by the idea of completing the palace, pouring every last resource into the construction, regardless of the financial cost to his kingdom. The palace, like Linderhof, was a monument to Ludwig's self-absorption, a place where he could escape from the pressures of ruling and indulge in his fantasies of power and grandeur. But as the palace rose higher, so too did the debts that threatened to consume the kingdom Ludwig had abandoned. The financial toll of these projects was enormous. As the construction of Linderhof, Neuschwanstein, and Herrenchiemsee consumed Bavaria's resources, the kingdom's finances grew increasingly unstable. The cost of these architectural endeavors far exceeded anything that could be justified by the kingdom's limited resources. Ludwig's obsession with fantasy and his refusal to face the demands of his real-world responsibilities were bankrupting his kingdom. The palace projects drained the coffers of the Bavarian state, leaving little for the essential functions of government. Public works were neglected, the military was underfunded, and the people of Bavaria grew increasingly disillusioned with their king. Yet, Ludwig, in his madness, remained oblivious to the suffering he was causing. The more the debts mounted, the more Ludwig retreated into his imaginary world, convinced that his dreams of grandeur would one day become reality. He cared little for the kingdom that was crumbling around him, for the people who were suffering under the weight of his projects. His mind was consumed with castles and palaces, with the images of grand courts and royal splendor, and he would stop at nothing to bring those visions to life. The political establishment in Bavaria grew increasingly frustrated with Ludwig's reckless spending. Ministers and advisors tried, in vain, to rein him in, to warn him of the dangers of continuing to fund his fantasy projects. But Ludwig, blinded by his obsession, ignored their pleas. His court, once full of royal officials and dignitaries, became more of a hollow shell as Ludwig isolated himself from the world. He spent his days in his palaces, shut off from the affairs of state, retreating further into his fantasy world. His advisors were forced to manage the kingdom's finances without his input, and even they struggled to maintain control over the nation's dwindling resources. The people of Bavaria, who had once looked to Ludwig for leadership, now saw their king as little more than a madman, a king who had lost touch with reality and was willing to sacrifice everything, his kingdom, his people, and his legacy, for the sake of his delusions. The growing financial crisis in Bavaria did not go unnoticed outside of the kingdom. European leaders watched as Ludwig's reign descended into chaos, as his once promising monarchy was consumed by the weight of his fantasies. Other monarchs, who had once admired Ludwig for his wealth and grandeur, began to distance themselves from him, seeing him as a liability rather than an ally. The people of Bavaria, too, began to turn against their king. Protests grew as the kingdom's finances worsened, and there were calls for Ludwig to step down and allow someone more capable to take the reins of power. But Ludwig, of course, could not be swayed. He was too entrenched in his own fantasies, too obsessed with his castles and palaces, to notice the growing discontent around him. The political establishment, the people, and even his own family grew desperate for a solution. But Ludwig remained a king in name only, a figurehead consumed by delusions of grandeur. The financial strain caused by Ludwig's architectural projects left Bavaria on the brink of collapse. The debts that had accumulated during the construction of Linderhof, Neuschwanstein, and Herrenchiemsee were insurmountable, and the kingdom's treasury was drained. The projects, which had once been symbols of Ludwig's dreams, became the very instruments of his downfall. His obsession with building palaces, with creating a world that existed only in his mind, led to the disintegration of the kingdom he was meant to lead. Ludwig's legacy, once full of promise, was now one of ruin and financial devastation. His reign, marked by extravagant dreams and reckless spending, would leave behind only the ruins of his castles and the debts he had piled upon the people of Bavaria. Ludwig II's other architectural ambitions, like Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee, were not just failures of leadership, they were the physical manifestations of his madness. Each palace, each project, was a desperate attempt to escape from the world he could no longer govern. But in his pursuit of fantasy, Ludwig destroyed the very thing he had been entrusted to protect, his kingdom. His obsession with grandeur, with beauty, with the mythical past was his undoing. His palaces, built with the blood and sweat of his people, became monuments to his failure, symbols of a king who had chosen to live in a world of his own making rather than confront the harsh realities of his reign. The financial crisis that followed his reckless spending sealed his fate. As the kingdom crumbled, Ludwig retreated further into his fantasies, until in the end, all that remained were his castles, beautiful, empty shells, reflecting the madness of the man who had built them. As Ludwig II's reign wore on, the once promising monarch became increasingly detached from the very affairs that had once demanded his attention. His growing obsession with art, music, and architecture drew him further away from the pressing matters of governance, and Bavaria, once the beneficiary of his kingship, was left to slowly deteriorate under his carelessness. The first signs of Ludwig's detachment came when he began to retreat more frequently to his isolated castles, the world outside his fantasy realm growing ever more irrelevant. The people of Bavaria, who had once looked to him for leadership, now found themselves abandoned, their king preferring to surround himself with works of art, listening to the music of Richard Wagner, and overseeing the construction of palaces rather than focusing on the nation's welfare. His ministers and advisors grew frustrated, helplessly watching as Ludwig slipped deeper into his delusions, retreating ever further into a world of his own making. Where once he had been a young king, eager to assert his authority, now he was a puppet in his own court, driven by whims and fantasies that had no place in the reality of the kingdom he was supposed to rule. His royal duties, once at the forefront of his mind, became secondary to his obsession with his personal, private world, and it was this detachment from the real world that would seal his fate. At first, his advisors tried to encourage him to take a more active role in the affairs of state, urging him to govern with a firm hand and take responsibility for the growing financial troubles that were beginning to plague Bavaria. But Ludwig, with his increasing disregard for the welfare of his people, would not listen. His mind was consumed with grand visions of castles and opera houses, of fairy tale kingdoms that existed only in his imagination. The harsh realities of the kingdom, its economy teetering on the brink of collapse due to Ludwig's reckless spending, could not penetrate the walls of the world he had created for himself. The more the country's finances spiraled into ruin, the more Ludwig retreated from the political stage, a monarch who had forsaken his role in favor of a life lived entirely for his own personal indulgence. The Bavarian government, once the strong backbone of the kingdom, began to lose its grip on power as Ludwig's detachment grew. Ministers and officials became little more than puppets in his court, executing orders that came not from a monarch who understood his people, but from a king who had lost all sense of responsibility. The royal palace became a palace of illusions, where Ludwig, surrounded by his grandiose projects, cared little for the suffering that unfolded outside its gates. The kingdom, once prosperous, was left to suffer the consequences of a king who could not see past his own fantasies. While Ludwig's relationships with his advisors and ministers deteriorated, tensions also began to rise within his own royal family. His eccentricities, once dismissed as youthful indulgences, had grown into a full-fledged detachment from reality, and members of the royal family began to grow increasingly concerned with his behavior. His mother, Marie of Prussia, had long been dismayed by Ludwig's strange tendencies, but even she could not ignore the growing distance between her son and his duties. His cousins, aunts, and uncles saw the young king's extravagant spending and his obsession with the grandiose projects as dangerous, and they became more vocal in their criticism. They called on him to focus on his duties, to take responsibility for the kingdom's faltering economy, and to rein in his excesses. But Ludwig, ever the monarch of his own dreams, ignored their pleas, trapped in a world where only the sounds of Wagner's operas and the whisper of winds in the towers of his castles held meaning. The royal family's frustration grew as they watched their king, once a young man full of promise, now reduced to a shadow of his former self, a king who could no longer be counted on to fulfill the basic duties of his office. And yet, Ludwig remained unshaken, more determined than ever to pursue his own vision of the world, no matter the cost to his kingdom, his family, or himself. His refusal to face reality alienated him from the very people who had once supported him, and as the cracks in his relationships with his family widened, his isolation deepened. What had once been a monarchy filled with a sense of unity and purpose was now a fractured, dysfunctional institution, a shadow of its former glory. But the strain with his family was not the only source of discord in Ludwig's life. His refusal to conform to the expectations of his role as king grew increasingly pronounced. Where once he had listened to the advice of those around him, now Ludwig rejected it entirely. He became stubborn, fixated on his own vision, and unwilling to make the compromises that were necessary for the functioning of the kingdom. When advisors urged him to focus on the pressing financial crises, Ludwig would dismiss them with a wave of his hand, retreating instead into the world of his castles, his art, and his music. The cost of his projects, from the construction of Neuschwanstein Castle to the extravagant palace at Herrenchiemsee, was astronomical, yet Ludwig refused to halt or even scale back his ambitions. The money that could have been used to stabilize the kingdom's economy, to fund essential public services, and to support the people was funneled into his dreams, into castles that would never be completed and projects that would only add to the kingdom's crippling debt. It was a rejection not just of advice, but of any sense of duty to his people. Ludwig cared little for the cries of his ministers or the concerns of his family. His kingdom, his people, his duties. All of these paled in comparison to the world he was building, a world in which he was both king and creator, in which his desires could take shape without limit. The more the kingdom spiraled into financial ruin, the more Ludwig held tight to his vision, refusing to bend, refusing to listen. It was a dangerous defiance, one that ignored the very real consequences of his actions, and it only hastened the kingdom's descent into disaster. As Ludwig's isolation deepened, so too did the rift between him and the Bavarian government. His refusal to engage with the political realities of his time, his rejection of royal duties, and his refusal to follow advice led to growing discontent among the political establishment. Ministers who had once been loyal to the king began to question his competence, and whispers of a royal coup began to spread. The once proud monarchy of Bavaria was no longer seen as a beacon of stability and strength, but as a fragile, failing institution, led by a king who had lost all touch with reality. His advisors, frustrated by their inability to rein in his spending or force him to take responsibility, began to look for ways to bypass the king entirely. The kingdom, struggling under the weight of Ludwig's extravagance, was on the verge of collapse, and there seemed to be little hope for salvation. Ludwig, however, remained locked away in his fantasies, his only concerns the completion of his castles, the music of Wagner, and the construction of his idealized kingdom. He could not see the disaster unfolding around him, and even if he did, he would have been unwilling to confront it. His refusal to listen, to adapt, to govern. These were the hallmarks of a king who was no longer in control, a king who had forsaken his duties and his people for the sake of his own delusions. It was this refusal to conform to the expectations of his role as king that would ultimately lead to Ludwig's downfall. His refusal to face the realities of his reign, his rejection of the advice of those who still cared for him, and his stubborn commitment to his own vision of the world only hastened the collapse of his monarchy. The political establishment grew more and more disillusioned with the king, and the once strong ties that had bound Ludwig to the royal family and the people of Bavaria began to fray. The kingdom, once full of promise and potential, was left to crumble under the weight of its king's fantasies. Ludwig had chosen to live in a world that existed only in his mind, and in doing so, he had condemned his kingdom to a slow, agonizing decline. The king who had once held so much potential, so much promise, was now a ruler of ruins, a monarch lost in his own delusions, with nothing left but the crumbling remnants of his dreams. And as he sat alone in his palaces, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Ludwig's fate was sealed. His isolation, his refusal to govern, and his obsession with his own fantasies had destroyed everything that he had once held dear. Ludwig II's reign was not merely shaped by his obsession with castles or his detachment from political realities. No, at the core of his delusions was a deeper fixation, one that reached into the very heart of his artistic soul. It was a fixation that involved the famed composer Richard Wagner, whose music and ideas would dominate Ludwig's thoughts and actions, leaving an indelible mark on his reign. The relationship between Ludwig and Wagner was not just one of patronage. It was an all-consuming obsession, a friendship that transcended the bounds of conventional royal favor. Wagner was more than just a composer to Ludwig. He was a godlike figure, an artist whose works seemed to align perfectly with Ludwig's visions of grandeur, fantasy, and the idealized past. To Ludwig, Wagner was not merely a man. He was a medium through which the king could escape the harsh world of governance and immerse himself fully in the art and mythology of his own making. Their relationship began in 1864, shortly after Ludwig ascended to the throne, and it quickly deepened into an unshakable bond. From the very beginning, Ludwig was captivated by Wagner's music that spoke of gods, heroes, and epic tales of love and betrayal. But it was not just the music that drew Ludwig in. It was the way Wagner's works seemed to embody everything Ludwig longed for in his own life: power, majesty, and a complete departure from the mundane realities of the political world. In Wagner's operas, Ludwig found a reflection of his own desires. The fantasy of ruling not a kingdom, but an empire built on the beauty of art and legend. The opera's grandiose themes of heroism, divine intervention, and tragic love mirrored the way Ludwig saw himself. A ruler fated for greatness, a king with a destiny far beyond the realm of ordinary governance. Wagner, with his towering operas and sweeping mythologies, became Ludwig's escape from a world that demanded far too much of him. Ludwig was drawn to Wagner not only as a patron of the arts, but as a kindred spirit, someone who understood the world Ludwig wished he could inhabit, a world of dreams, grandeur, and artistic perfection. But Ludwig's obsession with Wagner was not without its complications. As their friendship deepened, Ludwig's fascination with Wagner grew into something darker, more obsessive. It was not enough for Ludwig to simply appreciate Wagner's music. He sought to immerse himself fully in the world that Wagner's works created. He lavished the composer with wealth, lavished him with praise, and did everything in his power to make Wagner's life as comfortable as possible. Ludwig's patronage of Wagner went far beyond that of a typical royal benefactor. It was a manifestation of his desire to transcend the ordinary and to construct a reality where only the finest art and culture could exist. He poured vast sums of money into Wagner's works, funding the composer's operas and supporting the construction of the Bayreuth Festival Theater, a project that was as grandiose and excessive as Ludwig's own architectural ambitions. For Ludwig, Wagner's works became more than just art. They were the pillars of his kingdom of fantasy, the foundation upon which he could build his own legacy. Through Wagner, Ludwig saw a way to assert his dominance, not just as a king, but as a patron of the highest artistic order, a ruler whose taste and sophistication knew no bounds. The grandest of his castles, from Neuschwanstein to Herrenchiemsee, were conceived as more than just homes. They were shrines to the art and ideas Wagner embodied. And Ludwig, in his delusion, believed that by elevating Wagner to the level of divine status, he could somehow elevate himself as well. But as Ludwig's obsession with Wagner grew, so too did the tensions within the royal court. Members of the Bavarian aristocracy and the royal family, who had already grown weary of Ludwig's erratic behavior, became increasingly disillusioned with his excessive patronage of Wagner. To the court, Wagner was nothing more than a loud, arrogant outsider whose presence in the royal court was a scandalous affront to the established order. Wagner was a man of passion and excess, and his behavior, his lavish spending, his bold political opinions, his lack of regard for tradition, was seen as a dangerous influence on the young king. Ludwig's devotion to Wagner, however, was absolute. He believed that Wagner was not just an artist, but a genius who could elevate Bavaria's cultural standing to new heights. The more Ludwig aligned himself with Wagner's vision, the more alienated he became from the court and the more deeply entrenched in his own fantasies. His decision to lavish Wagner with royal patronage was seen by many as a betrayal of his duties as king. The royal family, who had long been concerned with the growing financial strain caused by Ludwig's architectural ambitions, saw the extravagant spending on Wagner's projects as a further indication of the king's inability to govern responsibly. The court saw Wagner's presence as a symbol of everything that was wrong with Ludwig's reign, an unholy alliance between the king and an outsider artist whose influence was eroding the very fabric of Bavarian tradition. As the rift between Ludwig and his advisors grew, the political establishment became more vocal in their disapproval of the king's patronage of Wagner. They accused Ludwig of neglecting his royal duties, of pouring money into projects that benefited no one but himself and his artistic circle. Yet Ludwig, in his detached state, refused to heed their warnings. He believed in Wagner's greatness, in the transformative power of his music, and he could not fathom why others could not see the same. Ludwig was so consumed by his desire to live in a world created by Wagner that he could no longer see the destruction his obsession was causing. The more the court disapproved, the more Ludwig shut them out. He became increasingly isolated, preferring the company of Wagner and his artistic entourage to that of the political advisors and royal officials who had once been his most trusted confidants. The court's growing animosity towards Wagner, and by extension Ludwig's patronage of him, only served to deepen Ludwig's resolve. To him, they were narrow-minded bureaucrats who couldn't understand the beauty and grandeur of Wagner's vision. They were the very people who had tried to constrain him, who had tried to force him into the mold of a traditional monarch. Wagner, in Ludwig's mind, was the key to his salvation, the one person who truly understood him, and he would not abandon him, no matter the cost. It was this stubborn refusal to bend to the expectations of his court and his family that would ultimately prove to be Ludwig's undoing. His obsession with Wagner became the lens through which he viewed everything, and it consumed him. His patronage of Wagner, already excessive, grew even more extravagant as the years passed. The financial burden of supporting Wagner's operas and his other artistic ventures drained the Bavarian treasury, pushing the kingdom into deeper and deeper debt. But Ludwig, lost in his fantasies, remained oblivious to the economic collapse unfolding around him. He poured money into Wagner's works as if they were the only things that mattered, as if Wagner could somehow redeem him and his failing reign. But the court and the Bavarian people could see only the ruin that was unfolding. The king who had once been a symbol of strength and potential was now a man lost in his own delusions, a monarch so consumed by his obsession with Wagner that he had forsaken everything else. The growing financial crisis, the mounting debts, and the kingdom's weakening power, none of it seemed to penetrate the bubble Ludwig had created around himself. The world outside Wagner's music and the grandiose plans for castles and opera houses was irrelevant to him. His court, once the center of political power, had become a mere bystander to the spectacle of Ludwig's reign. As the rift between Ludwig and his advisors deepened, the tensions within the royal family grew even more pronounced. They saw Ludwig's obsession with Wagner as a direct threat to the future of the monarchy. To them, Wagner was an outsider, a man who had no place in the royal court, and yet Ludwig treated him as if he were a deity. The king's growing infatuation with Wagner only served to alienate him further from those who were supposed to be his allies. The court and the royal family, once a unified institution, now found themselves fractured, divided by the growing power of an artist whose influence over the king seemed to grow with each passing day. The once glamorous monarchy of Bavaria, once known for its cultural achievements and political prowess, was now a shadow of its former self, its fate controlled by a king whose only concern was the fulfillment of his artistic vision. The political establishment watched helplessly as Ludwig's reign spiraled out of control, driven by a dangerous obsession with an artist who had no regard for the kingdom's needs. But Ludwig could see none of this. His mind was consumed with Wagner's music, and he was blind to the suffering he had caused, both within his own court and across the kingdom. His reign, once full of promise, had become a tragic tale of isolation, obsession, and financial ruin. In the end, Ludwig's relationship with Wagner would prove to be one of the most defining aspects of his reign and the most disastrous. It was not simply the excessive spending on Wagner's works, nor the neglect of his royal duties that would lead to Ludwig's downfall. It was the way in which Wagner's influence consumed Ludwig, leaving him unable to see the destruction he was causing. The king, who had once been full of potential and promise, had become a puppet of his own fantasies, a monarch lost in the music of a composer who cared little for the kingdom he was supposed to rule. The court, the royal family, and the people of Bavaria had all become mere bystanders to Ludwig's obsession with Wagner. His reign, marked by excess and delusion, would ultimately lead to his isolation, his fall from power, and his tragic demise. As Ludwig II continued his reign, the once glorious kingdom of Bavaria, which had once been filled with prosperity and promise, began to sink deeper and deeper into a financial abyss. The grand castles and opulent palaces he built, from Neuschwanstein to Linderhof, became more than just monuments to his delusions. They were the very instruments of his kingdom's ruin. The fiscal challenges that Ludwig's lavish construction projects imposed on the kingdom were staggering, and his complete neglect of state matters only exacerbated the situation. Ludwig, consumed by his fantasies and his obsession with creating a world of beauty and grandeur, had lost all sense of responsibility for the kingdom he was supposed to rule. While he spent vast sums of money on his castles, Wagner's operas, and his personal artistic endeavors, the people of Bavaria were left to struggle with the crushing burden of debt that had been incurred to fund these extravagant pursuits. Public services, infrastructure, and even the military were neglected, and the once proud Bavarian economy began to falter under the weight of the king's delusions. The king, who had once been heralded as a symbol of Bavaria's future, had now become a burden on the very people who had supported him. His disregard for the fiscal health of his kingdom was so severe that, by the time his financial mismanagement was fully recognized, the kingdom was facing a crisis that seemed almost insurmountable. Ludwig's obsession with his personal projects, his castles, and his fantastical dreams had drained the national treasury, and the deficit grew larger with every passing year. His court, once filled with pomp and grandeur, became little more than a stage for his delusions, a place where he retreated further and further into his world of fantasy. He was no longer the ruler of a kingdom. He was a king of castles, living in a dream world that had no place in the harsh realities of governance. As the financial strain deepened, Ludwig's ministers and advisors were left to pick up the pieces, trying desperately to manage the growing crisis, while the king continued to live in his isolated world, completely oblivious to the suffering around him. The public reaction to Ludwig's extravagant spending was one of widespread disillusionment and growing resentment. The people of Bavaria, once loyal to their king, began to see him not as a leader, but as a fool. An artist, yes, but one who cared little for the suffering of his subjects. The castles and palaces that he had built, once symbols of Bavarian grandeur, now became symbols of his failure as a monarch. The people, who had once admired Ludwig for his artistic vision, began to see him as a king who had abandoned them, a monarch who had put his own desires above the needs of the kingdom. As the economy worsened and public services deteriorated, the dissatisfaction with Ludwig's reign grew. The king's failure to address the financial crisis, his refusal to scale back his lavish projects, and his complete detachment from the real world led to a growing sense of betrayal among the people. They had once looked to Ludwig as a symbol of hope, but now he had become a figure of ridicule, a king who had failed to fulfill the duties of his office and had led his kingdom to the brink of ruin. The public discontent was further fueled by the political opposition that began to rise within Bavaria. As Ludwig's financial mismanagement became more apparent, calls for his abdication grew louder. The nobility, the political elite, and even members of the royal family began to question Ludwig's ability to rule. His reign, which had once seemed so full of promise, had descended into chaos, and there were growing concerns that the kingdom could not survive much longer under his leadership. Political opposition to Ludwig's rule began to gain momentum, and the calls for his removal became more urgent. His advisors, once loyal to him, began to turn against him, recognizing that the king's fantasies were leading the kingdom to ruin. Members of the royal family, too, grew increasingly frustrated with Ludwig's refusal to govern. They saw the king not as a ruler but as a madman, a king who had abandoned his duties in favor of his own personal obsessions. The growing rift between Ludwig and his family members reflected the growing discontent with his rule, and the kingdom began to fracture as political opposition gained strength. The pressure on Ludwig to abdicate grew as his financial mismanagement became impossible to ignore. The Bavarian court, once full of grandeur and pomp, had become a place of frustration and division. Ministers and advisors, unable to sway the king, began to conspire behind his back, discussing the possibility of removing him from power. The royal family, too, began to question how much longer they could allow Ludwig to reign. His eccentricities, his refusal to listen to advice, and his obsession with his castles and Wagner had drained the kingdom's resources to the breaking point. It became clear to many that Ludwig's reign, once filled with potential, had descended into madness, and that he was no longer capable of ruling. The growing calls for his abdication reflected the increasing sense of desperation within the political establishment. The kingdom, once a thriving and prosperous state, was now on the verge of collapse, and the royal family could no longer afford to stand by and watch as Ludwig's delusions drove them further into ruin. But Ludwig, ever the dreamer, refused to acknowledge the reality of his situation. He was consumed by his castles, his music, and his fantasies, and he could not, or would not, see the disaster that his reign had become. The kingdom's financial troubles were a mere inconvenience to him, something that could be ignored while he retreated into his personal world of art and imagination. His advisors and family members pleaded with him to take responsibility for the kingdom's plight, but Ludwig, lost in his fantasies, remained indifferent to their pleas. The more the kingdom suffered, the more Ludwig retreated into his world of castles and operas, unable to see the destruction he was causing. His refusal to confront the reality of his reign was a sign of just how far gone he had become. He could no longer distinguish between the world of his dreams and the world of governance, and the result was a kingdom on the brink of collapse, led by a king who had abandoned his people for the sake of his delusions. The political opposition to Ludwig's reign continued to grow as the financial crisis deepened. The calls for his abdication grew more urgent, and there was increasing pressure for him to step down. His ministers and advisors, frustrated by his refusal to govern, began to seek ways to bypass him entirely. The royal family, too, grew increasingly concerned with Ludwig's inability to fulfill his duties as king. But Ludwig, in his madness, refused to acknowledge the growing calls for his removal. He believed that his artistic vision, his dreams of castles and grandeur, were the only things that mattered. The kingdom, the people, the political establishment, all of them were secondary to his fantasies. And so, as the crisis deepened, Ludwig's isolation grew. His refusal to listen, his detachment from reality, and his obsession with his castles led to his growing irrelevance. He had once been a king full of promise, but now he was a king lost in his own delusions, a ruler who had abandoned the very people who had once supported him. As the financial strain continued to mount, public discontent reached its peak. The people of Bavaria, once loyal to their king, now saw him as a fool, a king who had betrayed them for the sake of his own fantasies. The political opposition grew stronger, and the royal family's calls for Ludwig to step down became more insistent. The kingdom, once prosperous and strong, was now teetering on the brink of collapse, and Ludwig, oblivious to the suffering around him, continued to live in his isolated world of art and imagination. The growing financial crisis, the mounting political pressure, and the increasing public dissatisfaction were all symptoms of a reign gone terribly wrong, and Ludwig, unable to confront the reality of his situation, remained trapped in a world of his own making. His refusal to govern, his obsession with his castles, and his detachment from the real world had doomed his reign, and the people of Bavaria could only watch as their king, lost in his dreams, led them further into ruin. As Ludwig II of Bavaria's reign continued down its increasingly erratic path, whispers of his mental instability began to circulate more frequently within the royal court, among his advisors, and throughout the political establishment. His eccentricities, once seen as mere quirks or youthful indiscretions, began to be viewed through a darker lens as the king's behavior grew more erratic, detached, and concerning. Those who had once been loyal to him found themselves at a loss as they watched a monarch, once full of promise and potential, slowly unravel before their very eyes. It became apparent that Ludwig's obsession with his castles, his art, and his fantasies was no longer just the pursuit of a passionate and imaginative ruler. It was the manifestation of a deeper, more troubling instability that could not be ignored. The grandiose projects he had once poured himself into now seemed like the work of a man lost in a dream world, unable to function in the real world of politics and governance. His increasing isolation, his refusal to engage with the concerns of his ministers and family, and his growing detachment from the people he was supposed to rule made it clear to those around him. Something was deeply wrong with their king. What began as a gentle murmur of concern soon swelled into a chorus of accusations and doubts regarding Ludwig's mental health, and with it, a sense of growing unease among the royal family and the political elite. The king's eccentric behavior, which had once been dismissed as the peculiarities of a young ruler, now seemed like a glaring sign of mental instability. Ludwig's refusal to engage with the reality of his kingdom's deteriorating finances, his withdrawal from the affairs of state, and his increasingly erratic decisions, such as his obsessive spending on personal projects and his insistence on living in isolation, painted a troubling picture of a man who could no longer function as a ruler. His political opponents and the members of the royal court, who had once hoped for his success, began to see in him not a visionary king, but a monarch consumed by madness. Ludwig, the king who had once promised to lead Bavaria into a new era, was now seen as a man unable to see beyond his own fantasies, a king who had become a prisoner of his own mind. The advisors who had once looked to him for guidance found themselves perplexed and dismayed by his behavior. His refusal to address the kingdom's problems, his detachment from the people's suffering, and his obsession with fantasy rather than the reality of governance created a climate of uncertainty and fear. It was no longer a question of whether Ludwig was fit to rule. It was a question of how far his madness had progressed, and what the consequences might be for the kingdom he had once ruled. As the evidence of Ludwig's mental instability mounted, attempts to diagnose the king's condition became a topic of intense debate within the Bavarian court. Physicians, psychiatrists, and members of the royal family all weighed in with their theories about the nature of Ludwig's madness. Some suggested that Ludwig was suffering from a form of paranoia, a delusion that had caused him to withdraw from the world around him, to see threats and conspiracies where none existed. Others speculated that the king was suffering from a more severe mental illness, perhaps a form of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, given his unpredictable mood swings and erratic behavior. There were those who believed that Ludwig's obsession with Wagner and his architectural projects had driven him to the brink of insanity, that his pursuit of grandeur and perfection had consumed him to the point where he could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy. And then there were those who simply believed that Ludwig was a victim of his own upbringing, his overbearing father, his isolation from the real world, and the immense pressure placed on him to be the perfect monarch had pushed him over the edge into madness. Yet, despite the growing chorus of concern about his mental health, Ludwig refused to acknowledge the possibility that there was anything wrong with him. He rejected any suggestion that he might be suffering from a mental illness, dismissing the theories of his physicians and advisors as the misunderstandings of people who could not comprehend the grandeur of his vision. The king, lost in his delusions, believed that he was not the one who was broken. He believed that the world around him was broken, that the people who questioned his vision were the ones who were mad. In his mind, he was not the one who had failed. The world was simply not ready to appreciate the brilliance of his artistic endeavors. Ludwig's refusal to accept any diagnosis or treatment for his supposed mental instability only fueled the rumors that swirled around him. He rejected every attempt by his advisors and physicians to intervene, refusing to submit to any form of psychiatric treatment or medical evaluation. This defiance only deepened the growing perception that Ludwig was beyond help, that his mind had become so far removed from reality that he could no longer function as a ruler, let alone as a person capable of making rational decisions. In his refusal to acknowledge his condition, Ludwig became both a prisoner of his own delusions and a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power. His kingdom, once full of promise, had now become a shadow of its former self, a place where the king's madness had led to a slow and painful decline. The more Ludwig refused treatment, the more he became a figure of fear and fascination, an enigmatic monarch whose mental health was a subject of constant speculation and dread. The court and the people of Bavaria, unsure of how to deal with a king who refused to be helped, were left to watch as Ludwig descended further into madness, locked away in his castles, lost in a world of fantasy while his kingdom spiraled into chaos. As Ludwig's mental health became the subject of intense scrutiny, the controversy surrounding his refusal to accept treatment reached new heights. Many within the royal family, who had once hoped that Ludwig's eccentricities would subside with age, now saw his rejection of medical intervention as a clear sign that he was beyond redemption. The royal family, long concerned with Ludwig's behavior, became increasingly alarmed as the king refused to listen to reason. Some began to question whether it was even possible for Ludwig to rule any longer. His refusal to accept medical help, his increasing isolation, and his utter detachment from reality made it clear that the king was no longer in control of his own mind. But Ludwig, in his delusions, remained steadfast in his refusal to acknowledge the severity of his condition. To him, the suggestion that he needed help was an insult, a sign that others did not understand the brilliance of his vision. Ludwig, trapped in his own world, could no longer see the damage he was causing, and the more he rejected help, the more isolated he became. His court, once full of hope and promise, was now filled with frustration and fear. Advisors, ministers, and even family members could only watch helplessly as Ludwig's mind deteriorated further, and the kingdom that had once thrived under his leadership fell deeper into crisis. The controversy surrounding Ludwig's mental health reached a boiling point when his advisors and royal family members began to openly discuss the possibility of removing him from the throne. It was no longer a question of whether Ludwig was capable of ruling. It was a question of how long he could continue to reign in his state of madness without destroying everything he had once built. Some suggested that Ludwig should be formally declared insane and removed from power, while others believed that his mental instability could be managed with the right treatment. But Ludwig, ever the defiant monarch, refused to listen. He rejected all offers of treatment, viewing them as an affront to his dignity and to his vision. The more the political opposition grew, the more Ludwig retreated into his delusions. He refused to be governed, he refused to be treated, and he refused to listen to the people who still cared for him. His defiance of medical intervention and his refusal to acknowledge the reality of his condition were symptoms of a king who was beyond saving. The more Ludwig resisted, the more the kingdom deteriorated. The public, the royal family, and the political elite all saw the same thing. A king who had lost touch with reality, a monarch who had let his delusions consume him. Ludwig II's mental health controversy, which began as a quiet whisper among his advisors, eventually became the defining tragedy of his reign. His refusal to acknowledge his madness, his rejection of medical intervention, and his growing isolation from the world only hastened the collapse of his kingdom. The king who had once been seen as a visionary, an artist who would lead Bavaria into a new era, had become a tragic figure, a man consumed by his own fantasies, unable to function in the real world. His refusal to seek treatment for his mental instability, his defiance in the face of growing opposition, and his stubborn commitment to his delusions ultimately led to his downfall. Ludwig, trapped in his own mind, became a prisoner of his own making, and as he descended further into madness, the kingdom he had once ruled was left to wither away. His refusal to confront his mental health, to listen to those who sought to help him, left a lasting legacy of ruin and tragedy. And in the end, Ludwig's refusal to seek treatment would be his undoing, as the dreams he had once pursued with such passion consumed him entirely, leaving behind only the crumbling remnants of his once great kingdom. Ludwig II's reign, once filled with dreams of grandeur and visionary castles, had deteriorated into a chaotic, almost surreal spectacle, characterized by a king completely removed from the reality of governance. His obsession with art, fantasy, and his increasingly erratic behavior had created a kingdom on the brink of collapse, with finances drained by lavish projects and a political system in shambles. In the wake of this unraveling, a conspiracy was quietly taking shape, a conspiracy aimed at deposing the king and ending his disastrous reign. Those closest to Ludwig, once his trusted advisors, now saw his behavior as dangerous, a destructive force that threatened the very foundation of the Bavarian state. Behind closed doors, the discussions grew more urgent, more insistent. How could they remove a king who refused to abdicate, who refused to face the reality of his own madness? Ludwig, with his eccentricities and complete detachment from the real world, had left his kingdom in financial ruin, but perhaps more dangerous still, he had lost all touch with the responsibilities of kingship. For his advisors and those within his royal family, it had become clear that Ludwig could no longer be allowed to reign. The question, however, was how to wrest power from a king who could neither understand his own condition nor recognize the need for his removal. The conspiracy to depose Ludwig took shape as a series of calculated political maneuvers. It began with the increasing realization that Ludwig's mental instability had rendered him unfit to rule. His refusal to acknowledge his condition and his complete disregard for the needs of his kingdom created an impossible situation for those still loyal to the monarchy. Ludwig had been an unwilling monarch for years, retreating further into his own fantasy world, refusing to engage with the political realities of Bavaria. His obsession with Wagner, his reckless spending on castles, and his disinterest in governance had drained the kingdom's resources, while its political structure continued to weaken under his inattentiveness. Those who had once supported him now saw him as a liability, a mad king whose whims could no longer be ignored. As the financial crisis deepened and public discontent swelled, those in power began to strategize. They needed to declare Ludwig unfit to rule, to remove him from power and restore some semblance of stability to Bavaria. But how could they do so? Ludwig, after all, refused to relinquish control of his throne. His stubbornness, his detachment from the reality that surrounded him, and his complete belief in his own invulnerability made him a difficult figure to challenge. The conspiracy, therefore, needed to be carefully orchestrated, a quiet, behind-the-scenes operation that would slowly and systematically undermine Ludwig's authority, while simultaneously building the case for his removal. The formation of the commission that would ultimately carry out Ludwig's deposition was a calculated move by those who saw his madness as a threat to the stability of the kingdom. The commission, which was initially tasked with investigating Ludwig's mental health, was formed by the royal family in collaboration with a select group of advisors, political officials, and medical professionals. Their goal was not just to assess the king's mental state. It was to gather enough evidence to declare Ludwig unfit to rule. At the center of the commission's efforts was the argument that Ludwig's eccentricities had crossed the line into insanity, that his behavior was no longer just the whim of a capricious king, but a clear sign of mental instability. The commission's findings would be the official justification for removing Ludwig from the throne and would serve as the legal basis for his deposition. The royal family, which had grown increasingly frustrated with Ludwig's behavior, saw this as the only way to save the monarchy. The royal court was fractured and divided, but most members of the royal family understood that Ludwig's reign had become untenable. The growing chaos of his rule, the financial strain, and the public discontent could no longer be ignored. The conspiracy to remove him from power was, in the eyes of many, a necessary evil, a way to restore some semblance of order to the kingdom and put an end to the reign of a king who had long since abandoned his duties. Ludwig's family, particularly his uncle Luitpold, played a crucial role in the conspiracy to depose him. Luitpold, who had long been one of the more politically astute members of the royal family, had witnessed the decline of his nephew with growing concern. Ludwig had once been seen as a promising young monarch, but his behavior had grown increasingly erratic, his decisions more bizarre and divorced from reality. As Ludwig's mental state deteriorated, Luitpold saw an opportunity to step in and assume control. Luitpold, who had already been acting as regent in Ludwig's absence on matters of governance, now saw the king's continued reign as a direct threat to the future of Bavaria. He knew that Ludwig, for all his grandeur and obsession with fantasy, was incapable of ruling. But Luitpold also understood that Ludwig's deposition had to be done carefully. It was not enough to simply demand the king's removal. It had to be done under the guise of legality, with a justification that would be accepted by the political establishment and the Bavarian people. Luitpold, ever the pragmatist, worked behind the scenes, using his influence within the royal family to sway the other members to his cause. Together, they pushed for the creation of the commission, and once the investigation was underway, Luitpold used his position to ensure that the findings would align with his goals. The commission's investigation into Ludwig's mental state was thorough, but it was also deeply political. The medical experts involved were tasked with diagnosing the king's condition in a way that would support the notion that he was unfit to rule. As the commission delved deeper into Ludwig's behavior, it became clear that his eccentricities had reached alarming levels. His obsession with castles, his refusal to engage with his advisors, his growing paranoia, and his increasing isolation all pointed to a man whose mind had unraveled beyond repair. But the commission's conclusions were not purely medical. They were driven by the political need to remove Ludwig from power. The royal family and Luitpold knew that declaring Ludwig insane was the only way to justify his removal. In the eyes of the royal family, This was a necessary step to protect Bavaria and restore stability to the monarchy. Yet even as the commission's findings began to take shape, there were some within the royal family who felt uneasy about the conspiracy. Removing a monarch, even one so clearly unstable, was no small matter. The legitimacy of the monarchy itself was at stake. But Luitpold was resolute. He knew that Ludwig's madness had reached a point where it was no longer a matter of personal eccentricity. It had become a threat to the kingdom. For Luitpold, the decision to remove Ludwig was not a moral choice. It was a pragmatic one. He believed that the kingdom needed a monarch who could govern, who could make the difficult decisions necessary to restore order. Ludwig had failed in that regard, and the time had come to take action. As the political maneuvering intensified, Ludwig's growing isolation made it easier for his family and advisors to press their case. The king, isolated in his palaces and obsessed with his castles and his music, had become increasingly detached from the world around him. His refusal to engage with the concerns of his court, his ministers, and even his family had created a vacuum of power, a vacuum that Luitpold and the others were eager to fill. Ludwig's inability to confront the reality of his situation had left him vulnerable. The political forces arrayed against him had gained enough momentum to make his removal a near certainty. Even as the conspiracy took shape, however, Ludwig remained unaware of the plot against him. He continued to retreat into his fantasy world, consumed by the construction of his castles and the music of Wagner, blind to the growing threat that loomed over his reign. The king who had once been the future of Bavaria, who had promised a new era of art and culture, was now a pawn in a game of political maneuvering. A king who had no idea that his reign was about to come to a devastating end. The role of Ludwig's family, particularly Luitpold, in orchestrating the plot to depose him cannot be overstated. Luitpold's political ambition and his sense of duty to the Bavarian state drove him to act decisively. He understood that Ludwig's rule, marked by madness and neglect, had to be brought to an end if Bavaria was to survive. While some within the royal family may have hesitated, Luitpold saw no other option. His ambition, combined with his pragmatism, made him the perfect figure to lead the charge to remove Ludwig from the throne. Luitpold's actions, though driven by a sense of duty, were also influenced by the growing sense of betrayal he felt towards his nephew. Ludwig's failure to fulfill his royal duties had left Luitpold with no choice but to step in and take control. He had watched as Ludwig's madness tore the kingdom apart, and he knew that if he did not act, the consequences for Bavaria would be catastrophic. The conspiracy to depose Ludwig was not just a political necessity, it was a personal one for Luitpold. He had once hoped to serve as a mentor to Ludwig, to guide him toward becoming a great monarch. Instead, he found himself taking the steps necessary to save Bavaria from the king who had betrayed his own throne. In the end, Ludwig's deposition was the culmination of years of political maneuvering, family betrayal, and growing discontent. His refusal to engage with his advisors, his detachment from the real world, and his complete disregard for the needs of his kingdom had led to his downfall. The conspiracy to remove him from power was not a decision made lightly, but it was a decision made out of necessity. Luitpold and the royal family believed that they were saving the monarchy, restoring order to a kingdom that had fallen into disarray under Ludwig's mad reign. But Ludwig, in his delusions, remained oblivious to the forces conspiring against him. He had built his castles, pursued his fantasies, and refused to listen to the warnings of those who still cared for him. And in the end, it was his madness that sealed his fate, leading to his eventual removal from the throne. A king lost in his own dreams, abandoned by those who had once been loyal to him. Ludwig II's final days are wrapped in an unsettling cloud of mystery and intrigue, as his imprisonment and subsequent death remain subjects of speculation and confusion. In the years leading up to his demise, Ludwig had been increasingly isolated, detached from the world that had once been his kingdom. His eccentricities and growing mental instability had left him vulnerable, and the once promising monarch had become a figure of tragedy, living in a self-imposed prison of his own making. The royal family, the political establishment, and his advisors had all come to the grim conclusion that Ludwig was unfit to rule. The decision was made to declare him insane, and with this declaration, the king was forcibly removed from power and confined at Berg Castle in 1886. This castle, perched on the edge of Lake Starnberg, would become the final place where Ludwig spent the last days of his life, a royal prisoner in the very kingdom he had once ruled. The events surrounding Ludwig's confinement are as shrouded in mystery as the king himself. Despite being declared mentally unstable, Ludwig was not placed in a typical prison. Instead, he was confined to Berg Castle, where he was under the care of his physician, Dr. Gudden. The king's detention, however, was not one of harsh imprisonment. His confinement at Berg Castle was, in many ways, a strange and uncomfortable compromise. Ludwig was allowed a certain degree of freedom within the confines of the castle, but he was under constant surveillance by the physician and a handful of guards. The situation was complicated by the fact that Ludwig refused to accept his situation. He did not see himself as mad. He saw himself as the victim of a conspiracy, a king betrayed by those who once served him. His obsession with the world he had created, the castles, the art, the music, remained as strong as ever. In his mind, the world outside his prison was nothing but a distraction, a world that had no place for him, a world that had wronged him by taking away his throne. Even in his confinement, Ludwig remained isolated, retreating into the world of his delusions, a monarch in a kingdom that no longer existed. But the kingdom that Ludwig had once ruled was now nothing more than a shadow of its former self, and the circumstances of his confinement mirrored this decline. He had gone from being a king of great promise, filled with dreams of grandeur and artistic achievement, to a man held captive by his own mind. Those around him, including his physician Dr. Gudden, were tasked with monitoring his mental state, but the situation grew increasingly tense as Ludwig refused to comply with their instructions. His obstinance, his delusions, and his complete detachment from reality made his captivity a volatile and difficult situation. Dr. Gudden, who had been appointed to oversee Ludwig's care, was caught between the king's refusal to accept his condition and the growing pressure to ensure that Ludwig did not pose a threat to himself or others. The physician's role in Ludwig's confinement, particularly in the days leading up to his death, would remain clouded in controversy. The relationship between Ludwig and Dr. Gudden, though professional, had an air of unease. Ludwig, who had once been the center of attention, now found himself under the control of someone he neither respected nor trusted, someone who represented the forces that had removed him from power. In Ludwig's mind, Dr. Gudden was just another part of the conspiracy that had stripped him of his kingdom, and this distrust likely played a role in the tense atmosphere that surrounded his final days. The night of Ludwig's death on June 13, 1886, remains one of the most mysterious and debated events in royal history. Ludwig, along with Dr. Gudden, was found dead by the shores of Lake Starnberg, under circumstances that remain unclear to this day. The details of the events leading up to the deaths are shrouded in confusion, and the lack of definitive evidence has left the incident open to speculation. What is known is that on that fateful night, Ludwig and Dr. Gudden were found in the water, both dead under mysterious circumstances. The exact cause of death remains uncertain, and the lack of witnesses or a clear explanation has fueled a variety of theories, each more perplexing than the last. Some accounts suggest that Ludwig's body was found floating in the lake, while Dr. Gudden's body was found nearby, suggesting that the two men had been involved in some kind of struggle before their deaths. The most chilling aspect of the entire incident is the utter lack of clarity regarding how or why Ludwig and Dr. Gudden ended up dead that night. Were they murdered? Did they die by accident? Or was it, as some suggest, an act of suicide? No one knows for certain. The absence of conclusive evidence and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the deaths have made it nearly impossible to determine exactly what happened that night. Theories about Ludwig's death have abounded since the night of his demise, with speculation ranging from suicide to murder and everything in between. Some have suggested that Ludwig, overcome by despair and madness, chose to end his own life in the waters of Lake Starnberg. This theory is supported by the idea that Ludwig was in a state of profound emotional distress, having lost everything he once held dear. The loss of his throne, his dreams of grandeur, and his kingdom, which had slowly disintegrated under his reign, may have driven him to a moment of irreversible despair. Ludwig's obsession with Wagner, his castles, and his delusions of royalty may have created an unbearable weight that, in his fractured state of mind, led him to choose the waters as his final refuge. This theory suggests that Ludwig's death was an escape from the reality he could no longer face, a tragic end for a king whose delusions had led him to lose everything. Another theory suggests that Ludwig was murdered, possibly by those who had orchestrated his removal from power. The idea that Ludwig was the victim of a political assassination is rooted in the belief that his deposition and confinement were part of a larger plot orchestrated by those within his own royal family and political circle. Ludwig's refusal to accept his removal from power, his stubborn resistance to the diagnosis of insanity, and his growing paranoia had made him an increasingly dangerous figure in the eyes of those who sought to protect the Bavarian monarchy. The theory of murder is further fueled by the fact that Ludwig's body was found in the water, suggesting that he may have been drowned, and the absence of a clear explanation for the deaths adds to the suspicion. Was Ludwig killed to silence him once and for all, or was it an accident that spiraled out of control? The lack of concrete evidence, along with the political climate at the time, has led some to conclude that Ludwig's death was the result of a well-planned and executed assassination, carried out by those who feared his madness and the potential for his return to power. Yet another theory suggests that Ludwig's death was an accident, perhaps a tragic incident during a nighttime walk by the lake. This theory posits that Ludwig, in his mental state, may have wandered into the water, where he drowned in a fit of confusion or despair. Dr. Gudden, who was with him at the time, may have either fallen or been dragged into the water during an attempt to assist Ludwig. The theory of an accident presents a chilling image of a king who, in the final moments of his life, was still lost in his own world, unable to navigate the real world he had so long abandoned. This theory also accounts for the lack of violence or clear signs of foul play, suggesting that Ludwig and Dr. Gudden may have died due to their own missteps, overwhelmed by the eerie isolation of the lake and the weight of their respective roles. Though this theory lacks the political intrigue of murder, it paints a tragic picture of a man who, in the end, was simply too far gone to save himself from the consequences of his own madness. Despite the many theories surrounding Ludwig's death, none can provide a clear and definitive explanation for what happened that night. The lack of witnesses, the absence of conclusive evidence, and the highly charged political atmosphere of the time have all contributed to the ongoing mystery of Ludwig's demise. It is clear, however, that Ludwig's death marked the tragic end of a life consumed by delusions, a life that had begun with such promise but ended in confusion, isolation, and despair. Whether his death was the result of his own hand, an external force, or a tragic accident, it remains a dark chapter in the history of Bavaria and a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and madness. In the years following his death, the mystery of Ludwig's final moments continued to haunt the Bavarian court and the people of Bavaria. His death, though shrouded in uncertainty, was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of power and the devastating consequences of a ruler who could not govern. His castles, his art, and his music, once symbols of his vision, now stand as haunting reminders of a king lost to madness, a king who had abandoned his kingdom in favor of an unreachable dream. The story of Ludwig II, the Mad King, is a tragic one, and his mysterious death only adds to the unsettling aura that surrounds his legacy. Even in death, Ludwig remains an enigmatic figure, a monarch who left behind a kingdom in ruins and a legacy defined by obsession, delusion, and an unyielding desire to escape the world around him. Ludwig II's reign, though mired in financial ruin and personal madness, left behind a profound legacy, one that continues to echo throughout the cultural and architectural landscape of Germany. Despite the tragic downfall of the king and the disastrous effects of his reign, the castles and artistic contributions that Ludwig championed have become timeless symbols, cherished both in Bavaria and internationally. The king's grand ambitions for architectural splendor, which seemed so disconnected from the realities of governance, resulted in some of the most iconic structures in Europe, each an embodiment of his fantasies and delusions. These architectural masterpieces, which were initially seen as symbols of extravagance and folly, have since evolved into symbols of Bavarian culture, attracting millions of visitors each year and becoming an integral part of the region's identity. Ludwig's castles, most notably Neuschwanstein, represent not only the aesthetic ideals of the king's vision, but also a broader cultural legacy that transcends the personal failings and tragic end of the monarch himself. Ludwig's influence on German architecture is undeniable. While many of his contemporaries viewed his architectural projects as the misguided whims of a mad king, these castles have become lasting representations of a particular vision of Bavaria, one steeped in myth, legend, and romanticized history. The castles are not merely buildings. They are visual manifestations of Ludwig's obsession with the past, with medieval knights, and with the ideals of chivalry that captivated him throughout his life. Neuschwanstein Castle, perhaps the most famous of these, remains a quintessential symbol of Bavarian culture and is universally recognized as one of the most beautiful and romantic castles in the world. Built atop the rugged hills of the Bavarian Alps, its towers and spires rise dramatically against the backdrop of the breathtaking landscape, creating an almost ethereal scene. The castle's design was influenced by a blend of Gothic and Romanesque elements, with its intricate facade, ornate interiors, and magnificent views all serving to transport visitors to a world of fairy tales and dreams. Neuschwanstein's romantic appeal has long captivated the imaginations of those who visit, and the castle's fame has spread far beyond the borders of Germany. While Ludwig's reign may have been defined by madness, his castles have transcended that madness, becoming emblems of Bavarian cultural heritage and symbols of the romantic idealism that Ludwig sought to perpetuate. The impact of Ludwig's castles on German architecture is particularly significant in that they represent an aesthetic departure from the rigid classical forms that dominated the period. Whereas many European monarchs of the time favored more neoclassical, symmetrical, and restrained designs, Ludwig's vision was bold, colorful, and untethered from tradition. His desire to create castles that evoked an emotional response, that transported the observer into a mythical past, was revolutionary. Ludwig's buildings, with their exaggerated towers, delicate carvings, and extravagant decorations, were not simply practical structures meant to house royalty. They were works of art. In their design, they merged elements of fantasy with reality, creating a space where the boundary between the two could be blurred. This architectural revolution, influenced by Ludwig's love for Wagner's operas and medieval history, led to the development of a distinctly Bavarian style that emphasized grandeur and theatricality. This approach to architecture, while initially viewed as indulgent and excessive, has since been embraced as an important part of Bavaria's cultural identity. Ludwig's castles, particularly Neuschwanstein, have been woven into the very fabric of the region's historical and artistic narrative, and their impact on German architecture is still felt today. Ludwig's architectural legacy extends far beyond the kingdom he once ruled, reaching across borders and captivating people around the world. After his death, his castles underwent a remarkable transformation. What had initially been built as personal sanctuaries, designed to house the king's fantasies, became sites of global fascination. Neuschwanstein, in particular, became a major tourist attraction, drawing millions of visitors each year to admire its beauty, history, and surreal fairy tale quality. The transformation of Ludwig's castles into tourist destinations speaks to the lasting allure of his vision. Despite the financial strain and the kingdom's collapse under his rule, the very structures that once symbolized his downfall have become symbols of beauty and inspiration for countless people. They represent not only Ludwig's artistic vision, but also the power of architecture to endure, even in the face of personal and political catastrophe. Today, Neuschwanstein is one of the most visited castles in the world, attracting visitors from every corner of the globe who come to marvel at its grandeur and to step into the dream world that Ludwig sought to create. What was once a kingdom in ruins is now a thriving cultural and tourist hub, a testament to the lasting power of Ludwig's architectural dreams. The transformation of Ludwig's castles into tourist attractions is a striking example of the paradoxical nature of his legacy. Though his reign was marked by financial ruin, political strife, and personal madness, the very structures he built as symbols of his delusions have become global treasures. Neuschwanstein and the other castles he commissioned have become a major source of income for the Bavarian economy, drawing millions of visitors each year. The castles, which were once viewed as extravagant follies of a king who had lost touch with reality, are now seen as symbols of beauty and cultural significance. This transformation reflects the power of art and architecture to transcend the circumstances of their creation, to endure beyond the lives of the individuals who created them, and to take on new meanings as they enter the public consciousness. Ludwig's castles have become more than just buildings. They are cultural landmarks, embodiments of a romanticized vision of the past, and symbols of a deeper, more universal human desire for beauty, fantasy, and escape. In this way, Ludwig's legacy lives on, not through his reign or his rule, but through the physical spaces he created. Spaces that continue to inspire awe and admiration long after his death. Ludwig's patronage of the arts was not confined solely to the realm of architecture. His relationship with the composer Richard Wagner had a profound impact on the development of both Ludwig's own vision and the cultural landscape of Bavaria. Wagner's music and ideas influenced Ludwig's architectural projects, and the king's support of Wagner's works helped to elevate both the composer and Bavarian culture to new heights. Through Ludwig's patronage, Wagner was able to complete some of his most famous operas, including Tristan und Isolde and Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, and his operatic style, marked by grandeur, emotional depth, and mythological themes, became intertwined with Ludwig's own vision of grandeur and idealism. Ludwig's deep personal admiration for Wagner and his work gave the composer the financial freedom and support he needed to continue his artistic endeavors. And in return, Wagner's operas became a central part of Ludwig's life and his reign. Wagner's influence on Ludwig was not just artistic but personal. Ludwig saw in Wagner not only a genius but also a soulmate, someone whose vision of the world mirrored his own, someone who could help him bring his dreams to life. The connection between the two men, built on shared ideals of artistic greatness and the pursuit of beauty, was as much about the personal as it was about the artistic. For Ludwig, Wagner's music became the soundtrack to his reign, a constant reminder of the ideals he sought to embody through his castles and palaces. Wagner's music, particularly the operas that Ludwig championed, has endured far beyond Ludwig's reign. Even after Ludwig's death, Wagner's works continued to influence the cultural and artistic landscape of Germany and beyond. The operas that Ludwig supported have become staples of the classical music repertoire, performed in opera houses around the world and celebrated for their emotional depth, innovative musical techniques, and grand scale. Wagner's influence, both as a composer and as a symbol of Romanticism, has left an indelible mark on the cultural history of Europe, and much of this influence can be traced back to Ludwig's support. The king's patronage helped to elevate Wagner from a controversial and often financially struggling artist to a central figure in the world of classical music. Ludwig's commitment to Wagner's vision of art, beauty, and myth contributed to the lasting impact of Wagner's work, ensuring that his operas would continue to be performed and admired long after Ludwig's death. In many ways, Ludwig's patronage of Wagner and his artistic contributions were part of a larger cultural movement that sought to reclaim and reimagine the past. The castles he built and the operas he supported were not just expressions of personal delusion or obsession. They were attempts to create something eternal, something that would transcend the limitations of time and history. Ludwig's desire to build a kingdom of beauty, fantasy, and myth was grounded in the belief that art could create a world that was not bound by the constraints of reality, a world that existed solely in the realm of the imagination. The castles, the music, and the cultural legacy that Ludwig sought to create were all part of this vision. And even though his reign ended in failure, the legacy of his dreams continues to endure. His castles have become icons of Bavarian culture. His patronage of Wagner has ensured the continued relevance of the composer's works, and the romantic vision of the past that Ludwig championed continues to inspire artists, architects, and musicians around the world. Through his architecture, his support of Wagner, and his vision of a fantastical, mythical world, Ludwig II has left an indelible mark on history. One that, for all his flaws and madness, will continue to captivate and inspire for generations to come. Ludwig II of Bavaria, often referred to as the Mad King, has long been a subject of fascination and intrigue. His eccentricities, his grandiose ambitions, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death have contributed to a posthumous reputation that straddles the line between genius and madness. In the years following his demise, Ludwig's image evolved from that of a misguided and eccentric monarch to that of a misunderstood genius, with his artistic and architectural pursuits gaining recognition far beyond his troubled reign. The Mad King myth, born from his behavior and the tragic end of his life, has remained a captivating aspect of his legacy, shaping how he is viewed by both the people of Bavaria and the world at large. But as time has passed and historical interpretations have shifted, Ludwig's life and actions have come to be seen not merely as the folly of an unstable monarch, but as the reflection of a tragic figure whose artistic vision and architectural endeavors transcended the limitations of his time. The Mad King myth is inextricably linked to Ludwig II's eccentricities and the final, mysterious events of his life. His reign was marked by extravagant spending on fairy tale castles and a near-obsessive devotion to the music of Richard Wagner, which caused widespread financial instability and alienated him from his royal family and political advisors. His detachment from the responsibilities of governance, his refusal to conform to the expectations of a traditional monarch, and his increasingly erratic behavior fueled the perception of Ludwig as a madman. But it was not only his eccentricities that contributed to the Mad King myth. His mysterious death in 1886, along with the circumstances surrounding it, further solidified this image. Ludwig's death, which occurred under unclear and strange circumstances, fueled speculation and conspiracy theories. His body was found in the waters of Lake Starnberg alongside his physician, Dr. Gudden, with no definitive explanation for how or why they had died. Some believed Ludwig had drowned himself in despair, while others suspected foul play. But the lack of conclusive evidence left room for countless interpretations. This ambiguity only deepened the myth of Ludwig as a tragic, misunderstood figure, a king who had lost touch with reality and whose death, like his life, remained a mystery. In the years after Ludwig's death, the narrative of his reign and character began to shift. While he was initially viewed as a mad king whose eccentricities had driven him to ruin, the passage of time allowed for a more nuanced interpretation of his life. Historical reinterpretations began to emerge, reframing Ludwig not merely as a mad monarch, but as a tragic figure whose artistic and architectural pursuits were far ahead of their time. His obsession with building castles like Neuschwanstein, his patronage of Wagner's operas, and his love for the medieval and romantic ideals that shaped his vision were no longer seen solely as the whims of a madman, but as a reflection of his deeper artistic sensibilities. Ludwig's commitment to creating a world of beauty and grandeur, though misguided and ultimately damaging to his reign, was recognized as a testament to his artistic vision. His castles, once viewed as extravagant follies, came to be seen as monuments to the king's desire to escape the constraints of reality and create something transcendent, something that would outlast him. This reinterpretation painted Ludwig as a figure not of madness but of misunderstood genius, a king whose legacy was defined not by his failures, but by his enduring artistic contributions. The more time passed, the more Ludwig was regarded as a tragic, visionary monarch, a king who sought to create a world of beauty and myth, but was ultimately consumed by the very fantasies he sought to bring to life. As Ludwig's legacy continued to be reassessed, his life began to take on a symbolic resonance. The castles he had built, once seen as impractical and excessive, became symbols of his dreams and his desires for an idealized world. Neuschwanstein, with its soaring towers and fairy tale atmosphere, became an emblem of the romantic ideals that Ludwig had so passionately embraced. His castles, once symbols of his madness, began to be regarded as works of art that reflected the cultural and artistic aspirations of his time. Ludwig's patronage of Wagner, though controversial during his reign, also gained recognition as a key aspect of his artistic legacy. Wagner's operas, supported by Ludwig's financial backing, continued to be performed long after the king's death, and Ludwig's role in fostering Wagner's work was acknowledged as a significant cultural contribution. The shifting perceptions of Ludwig from a mad king to a tragic figure whose artistic pursuits transcended his era reflected a broader cultural shift that valued creativity, vision, and the pursuit of beauty, even at the cost of personal and political stability. In this light, Ludwig became a symbol of the artist as tragic hero, someone whose genius could not be fully appreciated in his own time, but whose contributions were ultimately recognized as having a lasting impact on culture and history. In modern times, Ludwig II's life has become a subject of fascination for many, fueled by books, films, documentaries, and the continued popularity of his castles. The king, who once appeared as a tragic, isolated figure, has since become the subject of a vibrant cultural mythos, with his eccentricities and artistic vision sparking the imagination of people around the world. The modern fascination with Ludwig's life and legacy is multifaceted, as his story offers both the allure of a fairy tale king and the somber reality of a monarch whose dreams ultimately led to his undoing. The castles he built, particularly Neuschwanstein, have become global icons, drawing millions of visitors every year who come to see the spectacular structures that reflect the king's vision of a world apart from the mundane realities of life. The transformation of Ludwig's castles into major tourist attractions after his death speaks to the enduring power of his legacy. What once were symbols of the king's delusions have become treasures that embody the dream of a ruler who sought to escape the world and create a space of beauty, art, and fantasy. Neuschwanstein, in particular, stands as a testament to Ludwig's artistic vision and his ability to create something that has outlasted his reign, his madness, and his tragic end. Visitors from all over the world flock to the castle, marveling at its picturesque beauty and imagining the life of the man who sought to build an idealized world of myth and legend. Books and documentaries about Ludwig II have played a significant role in shaping modern perceptions of the king. Over the years, Ludwig has been depicted in a variety of ways. As a romantic idealist, a misunderstood genius, and of course, a madman consumed by his delusions. Some portray him as a tragic figure, someone who sought to create a world of beauty and art, but was ultimately undone by his inability to face the harsh realities of governance and life. Others focus on his more eccentric traits, painting him as a figure of whimsy and excess, a ruler who sought to live in a world of fantasy. The fascination with Ludwig is, in part, due to the contrast between his public persona as a monarch and his private dreams as an artist. His obsession with castles, Wagner's operas, and the mythical ideals that guided his vision have captured the imagination of those who see him as a symbol of artistic ambition and personal failure. His life has become a narrative of grand dreams and tragic consequences, a story that continues to resonate with modern audiences who are drawn to the myth of Ludwig as both a dreamer and a victim of his own fantasies. The modern fascination with Ludwig II extends beyond books and films. His life and legacy have inspired countless artistic works, from plays and operas to visual art and music. The king's obsession with Wagner has also sparked renewed interest in the composer's works, with Ludwig's patronage of Wagner's operas gaining recognition as one of the key contributions to the composer's success. Wagner's music, which Ludwig championed throughout his reign, continues to be performed in opera houses around the world, and the king's role in supporting the composer's vision has become an integral part of Wagner's legacy. The relationship between Ludwig and Wagner, while complicated and sometimes controversial, has come to symbolize the deep connection between art and power, between the artist and the patron. In this sense, Ludwig's legacy is not just confined to his castles or his political reign. It is also a legacy of artistic collaboration and cultural transformation. Ludwig's posthumous reputation is a complex and multifaceted one. His life, marked by eccentricity, delusion, and tragedy, has sparked a variety of interpretations, from the Mad King to a misunderstood genius whose vision transcended his era. Over time, historical reinterpretations have recast Ludwig as a figure whose artistic and architectural pursuits were ahead of their time, and his castles, once seen as the extravagant follies of a mad monarch, have become symbols of Bavarian culture and artistic vision. The king's obsession with beauty, fantasy, and myth continues to captivate audiences today, and his legacy lives on in the millions of visitors who flock to his castles, the continued popularity of Wagner's operas, and the books, films, and documentaries that keep his story alive. Ludwig II, once regarded as a tragic figure whose dreams led to his ruin, has come to be seen as a symbol of artistic ambition, a man whose vision of a world beyond the mundane has endured long after his death. Ludwig II of Bavaria, a king once seen as a figure of promise and ambition, ultimately fell victim to the very forces that should have supported him: the Bavarian monarchy and his royal family. His downfall, both political and personal, was inextricably tied to the machinations of those who surrounded him, including his own family members, who grew increasingly disillusioned with his eccentricities, his growing isolation, and his inability to govern effectively. Ludwig's reign, marked by a series of artistic and architectural endeavors that drained the kingdom's resources, left him estranged from the very people who had once supported him. His dreams of building a fantastical kingdom, filled with castles, art, and opera, were seen as foolish by his family and advisors. They regarded him not as a visionary, but as a monarch whose impractical ambitions had led the kingdom into financial ruin and political instability. This tension between Ludwig and the members of his royal family set the stage for the ultimate betrayal that led to his deposition and death. The political motives that underpinned Ludwig's downfall were not just the result of his perceived madness, but were also deeply influenced by his refusal to conform to the expectations of the Bavarian monarchy. As Ludwig's obsession with his castles and his refusal to engage with the practical matters of governance grew, so too did the frustration within his family. The royal family, particularly his uncle Luitpold, who had already served as regent in Ludwig's absence on many matters, found themselves at odds with the king's eccentricity. Luitpold and other family members viewed Ludwig's disregard for state affairs, his excessive spending, and his isolation from the realities of monarchy as a threat to the stability of the Bavarian state. The monarchy's political survival hinged on pragmatic rule, and Ludwig's increasingly erratic behavior and financial mismanagement made him a liability. Behind closed doors, members of the royal family began discussing the possibility of removing Ludwig from the throne. What had once been a kingdom of promise, led by a young king with a vision for the future, was now a kingdom on the brink of collapse, suffocated by debt and political instability. The royal family's role in Ludwig's fall was not just a result of personal grievances, but was deeply rooted in the political realities of a monarchy that could no longer afford the luxury of indulging the king's dreams. For the monarchy, Ludwig's reign had become a dangerous gamble, one that could only end in disaster for the Bavarian people. Ludwig's family, particularly those close to the throne, could not have been more different from the king himself in terms of their ideals and their approach to governance. Ludwig, a man consumed by dreams of beauty, grandeur, and artistic expression, saw his role as king as one of a patron of the arts, someone who could elevate Bavaria to new heights through the creation of castles and the support of great composers like Richard Wagner. His kingdom was not one to be governed with political acumen or fiscal responsibility. It was to be a kingdom built on the ideals of Romanticism, medieval myth, and artistic perfection. In contrast, Ludwig's family, particularly his uncle Luitpold, was far more politically minded. Luitpold was a pragmatist who understood that ruling a kingdom required attention to matters far beyond the artistic and the idealistic. The family was more concerned with preserving the monarchy's power and ensuring the political and financial stability of Bavaria. They viewed Ludwig's actions as reckless and self-serving, and his refusal to focus on state matters as an abandonment of the responsibilities that came with the throne. While Ludwig's dreams were filled with castles, Wagner's operas, and mythical visions of a medieval past, his family members were rooted in the harsh realities of ruling a kingdom. Ludwig's refusal to accept these realities only widened the rift between him and the royal family. And this stark contrast in ideals ultimately led to the political maneuvering that resulted in his deposition. His family, once his closest supporters, became his greatest adversaries, motivated by the desire to restore order and stability to a kingdom that had been brought to the brink of ruin. The growing isolation of Ludwig from both his family and the political establishment had devastating consequences for his reign. As he retreated further into his fantasies, building castles and indulging in Wagner's music, Ludwig grew increasingly detached from the world around him. His refusal to engage with the political realities of his kingdom led him to withdraw from any meaningful interactions with his ministers, advisors, and even his family. The more Ludwig isolated himself, the more his family, who should have been his support system, saw him as a liability. This isolation was not only physical but emotional and intellectual. Ludwig's obsession with his artistic pursuits led him to cut off any meaningful dialogue with those who could have helped him govern or solve the growing crises within the kingdom. His ministers and advisors were left to manage the kingdom's finances and day-to-day operations without his input, while Ludwig remained locked away in his castles, consumed by his dreams of beauty and fantasy. His family, too, found themselves increasingly distanced from him. What should have been a network of support, an institution of power, became a fractured and dysfunctional unit, divided by Ludwig's refusal to engage with the realities of monarchy. In this isolation, Ludwig became both a king and a prisoner of his own mind. The consequences of this isolation were severe. Not only did Ludwig lose his connection to the kingdom he was meant to lead, but he also lost the support of his own family, who were tasked with protecting the monarchy, but were instead left to watch as it crumbled under his reign. As Ludwig's mental state deteriorated and his family and advisors plotted to remove him from the throne, the consequences of his isolation became painfully evident. The political establishment had long recognized that Ludwig's reign had become untenable, but the royal family was now confronted with the reality that the king they had once hoped would lead them into a new era had become an obstacle to the monarchy's survival. Ludwig's failure to acknowledge his responsibilities as king, his reckless spending, and his detachment from the people of Bavaria had created a perfect storm of political instability. His isolation from the kingdom he had once ruled, both emotionally and politically, had left him vulnerable to those who would take action to remove him. The royal family, particularly Luitpold, began to take steps to secure their control over Bavaria, believing that the only way to restore order and stability was to depose Ludwig. His abdication was no longer a matter of royal prerogative. It was a necessity for the preservation of the monarchy and the kingdom itself. The final days of Ludwig's reign were marked by a growing sense of inevitability, as the political forces aligned against him and his isolation reached its apex. His family, once his closest allies, had become the instruments of his downfall, motivated not by personal animosity, but by the need to save Bavaria from further ruin. Ludwig's role as a monarch and the consequences of his isolation reflect the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of meaningful connections between a ruler and those around him. A king, no matter how visionary, cannot govern alone. Ludwig's failure to engage with his ministers, advisors, and family members left him blind to the very real problems facing his kingdom. His obsession with fantasy and his detachment from the world of governance created a vacuum of power that ultimately led to his deposition. The family dynamics that played a role in his downfall highlight the contrast between Ludwig's artistic, idealistic vision and the pragmatic, politically minded approach of his relatives. Ludwig's refusal to acknowledge the importance of governance and his growing isolation from both his family and the political establishment sealed his fate. His reign, once full of promise, ended not with the grandeur and glory he had sought, but with betrayal and abandonment by those who should have been his closest allies. The consequences of Ludwig's isolation, both as a monarch and as a man cut off from the world he had once ruled, serve as a cautionary tale about the perils of losing touch with reality and the importance of maintaining connections with the people who hold the keys to power. Ludwig's fall was not simply the result of his own madness. It was also the result of a failure of leadership, a failure to connect with the very forces that could have saved him. His family, despite their growing disillusionment with his behavior, had once been the foundation of his rule. The Bavarian monarchy was built on a network of relationships, alliances, and shared responsibility, but Ludwig's refusal to engage with these relationships left him isolated in a world of his own making. The political forces that worked against him were not inherently evil or malicious. They were, in the eyes of those who sought to remove him, simply trying to restore order to a kingdom that had been brought to the brink of collapse. Ludwig's downfall, while tragic, was also inevitable. His inability to adapt to the realities of governance, his refusal to acknowledge the consequences of his actions, and his growing isolation from both his family and the political establishment created a situation where his deposition was the only way to preserve the monarchy. The royal family's actions, driven by a desire to save Bavaria, ultimately resulted in Ludwig's removal from power, a tragic and cruel end to a reign that had begun with so much promise. Ludwig's story is a reminder of the dangers of isolation, of the importance of maintaining meaningful connections with those who govern with you, and of the consequences of failing to face the realities of power. Ludwig II of Bavaria, often remembered as the Mad King, remains one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in European history. His reign, marked by extravagant spending, a deep obsession with art, and the construction of fairy tale castles, was simultaneously one of great promise and tragic downfall. Ludwig's legacy, once overshadowed by accusations of madness and eccentricity, has undergone a significant reassessment over time. While some continue to view him as a mad monarch whose delusions led to the downfall of his kingdom, others argue that Ludwig was, in fact, a misunderstood genius whose artistic and architectural vision transcended his time. As history looks back on Ludwig's life, it becomes increasingly clear that his legacy cannot be neatly categorized into simple labels of madness or genius. Instead, it is a complex and multifaceted story of a man whose artistic dreams, mental struggles, and tragic end have left an indelible mark on both Bavaria and the world. The question of whether Ludwig II was truly mad or merely an artistic visionary is one that has persisted throughout history. His eccentric behavior, obsessive building projects, and rejection of his royal duties led to the widespread belief that he had succumbed to madness. His refusal to engage with the political realities of his time, his detachment from the governance of Bavaria, and his extravagant spending on projects like Neuschwanstein Castle and the Bayreuth Festival Theatre were seen as symptoms of a ruler who had lost touch with reality. The conspiracy to depose him, orchestrated by his family and advisors, further cemented the idea of Ludwig as a king whose delusions had put the monarchy in danger. Yet, over time, the narrative surrounding Ludwig has shifted. His grandiose architectural endeavors, once viewed as indulgent follies, have come to be appreciated as significant artistic achievements. His patronage of Richard Wagner, whose operas were often seen as too radical for their time, has been re-evaluated as a testament to Ludwig's support of cultural innovation and artistic expression. In this sense, Ludwig's madness can be seen as the product of an intensely creative mind that was so consumed by his artistic vision that he was unable to balance it with the practicalities of governance. His castles, now considered masterpieces of romantic architecture, reflect the depth of his vision and the extent to which he was willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of beauty and fantasy. However, it is important to consider what Ludwig's reign might have looked like had his vision been better supported, or if his mental health had been properly addressed. In an alternate reality, Ludwig's obsession with architecture and art could have been channeled into a more sustainable and productive pursuit. Imagine, for a moment, a world in which Ludwig had been able to engage with his ministers and advisors, balancing his artistic ambitions with the needs of his kingdom. Had his mental health been properly understood and treated, perhaps Ludwig could have been guided toward a more rational path, one in which he could have preserved the grandeur of his castles while also addressing the financial and political crises that plagued Bavaria. Had Ludwig been able to navigate the complexities of statecraft, he may have been able to leave behind a lasting legacy, not just in the form of his castles, but also as a ruler who successfully merged artistic innovation with political responsibility. His reign could have been one of cultural renaissance for Bavaria, with the king at the forefront of both artistic and political progress. But this, of course, is mere speculation. The fact remains that Ludwig's refusal to engage with the realities of his reign, his rejection of advice from those around him, and his inability to balance his personal vision with the needs of his kingdom led to his downfall. Had Ludwig's vision been better supported, perhaps Bavaria would have experienced an era of artistic and architectural innovation that would have rivaled the greatest periods of European history. Ludwig's castles, particularly Neuschwanstein, are testament to the extraordinary beauty and ambition of his ideas, but they were built at the expense of the kingdom's financial stability. Imagine, for a moment, if Ludwig had been able to reconcile his artistic dreams with the practical needs of his people. His patronage of Wagner, if coupled with more thoughtful economic and political decisions, could have elevated Bavarian culture to new heights. The kingdom, while struggling financially under Ludwig's reign, could have been transformed into a center of artistic and cultural flourishing. Ludwig's legacy might have been one of great accomplishment, where his castles and Wagner's operas were celebrated as symbols of a vibrant and prosperous kingdom. Yet, instead of these dreams being realized, Ludwig's vision became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of a ruler's isolation from the world he is meant to govern. As history has progressed, Ludwig II has become a figure of fascination, not only for historians but also for popular culture. His story has been retold in countless books, documentaries, films, and artistic works, each offering a different perspective on his life, his reign, and his ultimate demise. His castles, which were once seen as the foolish whims of a mad monarch, have become iconic symbols of Bavarian culture, attracting millions of tourists each year. Neuschwanstein Castle, in particular, has become one of the most recognized and photographed landmarks in the world, and its image is often associated with fairy tales and fantasy. The very castles that were once derided as symbols of Ludwig's madness have now become enduring testaments to his artistic vision. The transformation of Ludwig's architectural projects from symbols of ruin to cultural icons is a testament to the way in which time and historical reassessment can alter the perception of a figure's legacy. In popular culture, Ludwig has taken on a mythical status, his life and death shrouded in intrigue and mystery. His story has been romanticized in films, operas, and books, with varying degrees of accuracy. The notion of the Mad King, misunderstood and isolated, has resonated deeply with audiences, who are drawn to the tragedy of his life and the beauty of his castles. Ludwig's obsession with Wagner and his passionate pursuit of artistic perfection have made him a symbol of the tortured artist, a man whose dreams were too grand for the world around him. His story has captured the imagination of countless people, and his castles have become symbols of the timeless appeal of fantasy, escapism, and romanticism. The contrast between Ludwig's personal failings and his artistic legacy has made him a compelling figure for both historians and the general public. In many ways, he embodies the idea of the artist as a tragic hero, someone whose vision and ambition lead to their undoing. One of the most enduring aspects of Ludwig's legacy is the way in which his story continues to captivate modern audiences. His life has been portrayed as a tale of idealism and madness, with the king representing both the heights of artistic genius and the depths of personal despair. Ludwig's story has become more than just the story of a Bavarian king. It is the story of a man who sought to create something beautiful, something lasting, but whose own mental state and isolation led to his ultimate demise. This duality has made Ludwig a figure of both sympathy and fascination. The idea that Ludwig could have been a great ruler, had he only been able to reconcile his artistic vision with the realities of governance, is a compelling one. It speaks to the timeless human desire to transcend the mundane, to create something lasting and beautiful, even at great personal cost. Ludwig's life and death serve as a poignant reminder of the dangers of isolation and the importance of balancing personal dreams with the responsibilities that come with power. The contemporary fascination with Ludwig II is also fueled by the mystery surrounding his death. The circumstances of his demise, which remain unclear to this day, add an element of intrigue to his story. Theories about his death, ranging from suicide to murder to an accidental drowning, have kept the mystery alive for over a century. His death, along with his life, has become a subject of endless speculation, and the lack of a clear resolution only deepens the sense of mystery and tragedy that surrounds his legacy. The fact that Ludwig's life and death continue to be the subject of books, films, and documentaries speaks to the enduring fascination with the man who sought to create a dream world, and in the process, lost touch with the reality that ultimately consumed him. Ludwig's legacy, shaped by both his madness and his artistic genius, remains a complex and multifaceted one. The king who built castles and supported Wagner's operas may have been a tragic figure, isolated from both his family and his kingdom, but his artistic contributions have transcended his personal failings. His castles, now seen as masterpieces of architecture, continue to inspire awe and wonder, and Wagner's operas, supported by Ludwig's patronage, remain central to the world of classical music. Ludwig's legacy, once defined by his madness, has become one of artistic achievement and cultural impact, even as his personal story remains a cautionary tale of ambition, isolation, and the dangers of losing touch with the world around you. The Mad King myth has given way to a more nuanced understanding of Ludwig's life, and his artistic vision, once thought to be the product of a madman, is now recognized as a remarkable contribution to the cultural history of Europe. Despite the tragedy of his reign and death, Ludwig II's legacy endures, both as a symbol of artistic genius and as a figure whose story continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Ludwig II of Bavaria, known as the Mad King, is a figure whose legacy is deeply entwined with both brilliance and tragedy. His reign, marked by the construction of monumental castles like Neuschwanstein and his obsessive patronage of Richard Wagner, remains one of the most controversial periods in Bavarian history. Despite the chaos and financial ruin that accompanied his rule, Ludwig's influence on Bavarian culture and European art is undeniable. His eccentricities, madness, and eventual downfall have defined much of his posthumous reputation. Yet, as history has advanced, a more nuanced reflection on his reign allows for a complex understanding of his legacy. Ludwig's reign, though fraught with personal delusions and irresponsible leadership, was also a time of remarkable cultural achievements that have left an indelible mark on the world. The castles he built, the operas he supported, and the dreamlike visions he pursued have become integral to Bavarian culture and global artistic heritage. The complexity of Ludwig's legacy lies in this duality. His reckless ambitions led to the destruction of his kingdom, yet those very ambitions also gave birth to a cultural renaissance that still resonates today. Thus, Ludwig's impact on Bavaria and the cultural landscape must be viewed through the lens of both his failures and his triumphs, as his contributions to art, architecture, and music have stood the test of time. Ludwig II's reign, despite its many missteps, played a significant role in shaping the future of Bavaria and its cultural identity. His obsession with castles and architecture was not merely a personal indulgence. It was a vision that sought to create a lasting legacy. Neuschwanstein Castle, perhaps the most iconic of his creations, has become an emblem of Bavarian culture. Its towering spires, perched on the edge of the Bavarian Alps, have captured the imaginations of millions, transforming Ludwig's private dream into a global cultural phenomenon. The castles he commissioned, from Lindenhof to Herrenchiemsee Sea, were not just extravagant displays of wealth, but artistic expressions that sought to transport visitors into a world of myth, romance, and fantasy. The architectural style Ludwig embraced, combining medieval elements with the Gothic and Baroque traditions, helped to redefine the visual identity of Bavaria, turning it into a place of awe and wonder for those who visited and for future generations. These castles, built during a time of political upheaval and financial crisis, have outlived the king who created them and are now regarded as masterpieces of European Romanticism. Through his castles, Ludwig left an enduring cultural mark on Bavaria, transforming it into a beacon of fantasy and art that draws millions of tourists each year. However, while his architectural contributions may have been celebrated, Ludwig's reign was marked by severe political and financial instability. His extravagant spending on his castles, combined with his detachment from the practical responsibilities of kingship, drained the Bavarian treasury. His obsession with art and architecture left him isolated from the very political structures that were supposed to support his rule. As Ludwig poured money into his castles and Wagner's operas, the kingdom's financial resources dwindled, leading to a crisis that eventually forced the royal family and political establishment to take drastic measures. The growing discontent with Ludwig's behavior, his refusal to govern effectively, and his complete disregard for the kingdom's pressing issues led to his deposition. His reign, once filled with the promise of cultural renaissance, ended in political failure and financial ruin. The kingdom that Ludwig had inherited, and which he had hoped to elevate through art and beauty, was left in shambles after his downfall. Yet, even as Ludwig's reign ended in tragedy, his cultural contributions outlasted his political failures. His castles, once symbols of his madness, have since become enduring symbols of Bavaria's cultural identity, and his patronage of Wagner has ensured that the composer's operas remain a vital part of the classical music repertoire. Thus, Ludwig's legacy is a reminder of the complex interplay between vision and reality, between artistic ambition and the harsh demands of governance. Ludwig's life, marked by a fierce commitment to his artistic dreams, ended in tragedy. His vision of creating a kingdom that celebrated art, beauty, and fantasy was noble in its aspirations, but ultimately unsustainable in the face of the realities of political and financial governance. The king who had dreamed of transforming Bavaria into a center of artistic and cultural achievement was undone by his inability to balance these dreams with the practical needs of his kingdom. His refusal to confront the financial and political crises that plagued Bavaria, combined with his isolation from the very people who could have helped him, sealed his fate. Ludwig's end was not just the result of his delusions. It was the culmination of his failure to recognize the limitations of his vision and the destructive nature of his obsession with art and beauty. He became a tragic figure, a monarch whose genius was overshadowed by his inability to govern, whose dreams were too large for the time and circumstances in which he lived. The fact that Ludwig's artistic vision and his castles continue to inspire admiration and wonder today speaks to the enduring power of his dreams. Yet his personal tragedy, marked by isolation, failure, and eventual death under mysterious circumstances, serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of losing touch with reality. Ludwig II's tragic end raises the question of whether he was truly mad or simply a visionary whose dreams were too grand for his time. The label of the Mad King was applied to him during his lifetime and has persisted in popular culture, fueled by his eccentric behavior, his obsession with castles and Wagner's music, and his eventual downfall. His refusal to accept the realities of governance, his reckless spending, and his retreat into a world of fantasy made him appear, to many, as a monarch out of touch with the world around him. His eccentricities and isolation, combined with the growing evidence of his mental instability, led to the perception of Ludwig as a madman, whose delusions and fantasies were the cause of his failure as a ruler. However, this view of Ludwig as a mad king is too simplistic, and a closer examination of his life reveals a more complex and tragic figure. Ludwig was not merely mad. He was a man whose vision of art, beauty, and fantasy was too much for the kingdom he was meant to rule. His failure to reconcile these dreams with the realities of governance, along with his inability to connect with his advisors and family, led to his downfall. In this sense, Ludwig can be seen not as a madman, but as a visionary who was ahead of his time, whose artistic and architectural dreams were too ambitious and too costly for the world he inhabited. Ludwig's story, therefore, is not one of simple madness, but of a man whose artistic aspirations collided with the harsh realities of his political and financial circumstances. He was a king who sought to create a world of beauty and art, a kingdom that would stand as a testament to his vision. but he was unable to bring this vision to fruition without sacrificing the very things that were necessary for a functioning monarchy. Had Ludwig been able to navigate the complex world of politics and governance, perhaps his vision would have been more successful, and he would have been remembered as a great cultural leader, rather than as a tragic figure. Instead, his story is one of ambition and failure, of a man who sought to build something beautiful but ultimately destroyed the kingdom he ruled. The question of whether Ludwig was truly mad or simply a visionary is ultimately one of perspective. While his eccentricities and failures as a ruler cannot be ignored, his artistic legacy, his castles, his patronage of Wagner, and his commitment to the pursuit of beauty has outlasted the political instability and personal tragedy that marked his reign. Ludwig's legacy, though tragic, speaks to the enduring power of artistic vision, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles. The fascination with Ludwig II continues to this day, fueled by his tragic story, his artistic legacy, and the enduring mystery of his death. The king who dreamed of creating a kingdom of beauty and fantasy has become a figure of legend, his life and death the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films. His castles, once symbols of his madness, have become cultural icons, attracting millions of visitors each year who come to marvel at the architectural masterpieces that stand as a testament to his vision. The king who was once viewed as a madman is now regarded by many as a tragic figure whose dreams were too grand for his time. The enduring fascination with Ludwig is not just about his eccentricities or his downfall. It is about the way his life and legacy continue to captivate the imagination. He represents the timeless human desire to create something lasting, something beautiful, even in the face of personal and political ruin. Ludwig's story is both a cautionary tale and an inspiring testament to the power of artistic vision, and it is this duality that continues to make him a figure of intrigue and fascination. His life, filled with dreams, delusions, and a tragic end, serves as a reminder of the dangers and the beauty of ambition, and the complex nature of legacy that endures long after the life that created it has passed. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.